In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a stranger arrives, retired schoolteacher, Miss Primrose, with a twinkle in her eye and a secret she guards closely. But who is she really? Why is she prying into whispered scandals and stolen heirlooms? As cryptic letters hint at murder and a shadowy figure stalks Thornton Manor, one question burns. Can this unassuming woman unmask a cunning killer before they strike her? Will her clever disguise be her downfall? Dive into a web of deception, poisoned secrets, and a deadly plot that only the sharpest mind can unravel. Chapter 1. The Village Masquerade. The train rattled gently as it wound through the emerald hills of the English countryside, its whistle a soft lament against the morning mist. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically in her lap, gazed out the window at the patchwork of fields and hedgerows. To the world, she was Miss Primrose, a retired schoolteacher with a penchant for pressed flowers and quiet evenings. Her grey hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, her spectacles perched low on her nose, and her tweed coat, carefully chosen for its unremarkable cut, completed the disguise. Only her eyes, sharp and unyielding, betrayed the mind that never rested. St. Mary Mead awaited, a village so picturesque it seemed conjured from a postcard, yet simmering with secrets. Jane had received a series of anonymous letters, each penned in a spidery hand and posted from the village postbox. They spoke of a murder yet to happen, a shadow looming over Thornton Manor, home to the wealthy and reclusive Squire Thornton. The letters were vague, teasing, almost playful, but Jane knew better than to dismiss them. Evil, she had learned, often hid behind the mundane, and St. Mary Mead was just the sort of place where it thrived unnoticed. She stepped off the train at the tiny station, her suitcase light but her purpose heavy. The platform was deserted, save for a porter, a boy no older than 16, who tipped his cap and offered to carry her bag. "No need, young man," she said, her voice soft but firm, adopting the slightly tremulous tone of Miss Primrose. "I'm quite capable, thank you." He grinned, unabashed, and pointed her toward the village square, where the annual fete was already in full swing. The square was a riot of colour and sound. Bunting fluttered between lampposts, and stalls lined the cobblestones, offering homemade jams, knitted scarves, and jars of pickled onions. Children darted through the crowd, clutching sticky toffee apples, while a brass band played a jaunty tune that clashed delightfully with the chatter of villagers. Jane, as Miss Primrose, smiled benignly, her eyes scanning every face, every gesture. She noted the butcher's wife, her laugh too loud, her hands twisting a handkerchief, the vicar, who lingered too long at the cider store, and a young woman with auburn hair, standing apart, her gaze fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something or someone. "Welcome, welcome," boomed a voice, and Jane turned to see a portly man in a tweed jacket, his face flushed with enthusiasm. "You must be Miss Primrose, our new arrival. I'm Mayor Grimsby, delighted to meet you." His handshake was hearty, his smile practiced, but Jane caught the flicker of calculation in his eyes. He was assessing her, as people often did, and finding her unthreatening. "Perfect, thank you, Mayor," she replied, her voice carrying the gentle lilt of a woman who had spent decades corralling schoolchildren. "What a charming fate. I've heard such lovely things about St. Mary Mead." "Oh, it's the heart of the county," he declared, puffing out his chest. "Care to join the raffle? Or perhaps you'd fancy the cake store, Mrs. Hinchley's lemon drizzle is legendary." Jane nodded, allowing herself to be swept along. her senses attuned to the undercurrents beneath the merriment. She purchased a raffle ticket, complimented Mrs. Hinchley's cake, and lingered at a stall selling hand-painted bookmarks, all the while listening. Snatches of conversation drifted to her, complaints about the squire's new gatekeeper, whispers of a stolen brooch, and a curious mention of Clara's temper. Clara, she recalled from the letters, was Squire Thornton's niece, estranged, and recently returned. The name carried weight, and Jane filed it away. As the afternoon sun climbed, the fete grew livelier. A tug-of-war was organised near the duck pond, with burly farmers pitted against the village cricket team. Jane found a bench beneath an ancient oak and settled with her knitting, her needles flashing as she observed. The young woman with auburn hair, Clara, she deduced, from the way others glanced at her, stood near a stall selling lavender sachets. She was striking, with high cheekbones and a defiant tilt to her chin, but her eyes held a wariness that intrigued Jane. Clara was arguing, quietly with a man in a tailored coat, his gestures sharp, his voice low. Jane couldn't hear the words, but the tension was palpable. "Miss Primrose, is it?" A voice interrupted her thoughts, and Jane looked up to find a woman with a pinched face and a basket of scones. "I'm Mrs. Pemberton, from the Women's Institute. We're ever so glad you've come to our little village." "How kind," Jane said, her smile warm but her mind elsewhere. "I've been admiring the fete. So much spirit here." "Oh, indeed." Mrs. Pemberton leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Though, mind you, not everyone's as cheerful as they seem. That Clara Thornton, for instance, back after years away, stirring up trouble with her uncle. They say she's after his fortune, but I say there's more to it. And that squire, holed up in his manor like a hermit." Jane tilted her head, feigning mild curiosity. "Trouble? Oh dear, she seems such a lovely young woman." "Mrs. System," Pemberton snorted softly, adjusting her basket. "Lovely perhaps, but headstrong. Always was, even as a girl. Ran off to London, they say, and came back with notions. Squire Thornton's not been the same since she returned. Keeps to himself, locks his study, and well, you didn't hear it from me, but there's talk of missing heirlooms up at the manor." Jane's needles paused for a fraction of a second, then resumed their steady rhythm. "Missing heirlooms. How intriguing," she said, her tone light, as if she were merely indulging village gossip. "I suppose every grand house has its mysteries." "Oh, Thornton Manor's full of them," Mrs. Pemberton said, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of sharing secrets. "A sapphire brooch, they say, gone from the squire's late wife's collection. Some think Clara took it to spite him, but I reckon there's more to it. You mark my words, Miss Primrose, something's brewing." Jane nodded, her expression one of polite interest, but her mind was racing. The letters had mentioned a theft as a prelude to something darker. Was the brooch, the key, or merely a distraction? She thanked Mrs. Pemberton, who bustled off to scold a child pilfering biscuits, and turned her attention back to Clara. The young woman was now alone, her earlier companion gone. She stood by the pond, tossing pebbles into the water, each ripple catching the sunlight like a fleeting clue. The fete continued, with a dog show drawing a crowd to the village green. Jane wandered closer, her knitting tucked into her bag, and positioned herself near a group of farmers discussing the squire's recent land purchases. "He's buying up half the county," one grumbled, his pipe clenched between his teeth. "Won't say why, but it's got the tenants riled. And that new gatekeeper of his shifty sort, always watching. Jane filed this away, too. Squire Thornton's behaviour reclusive, secretive, and now acquisitive suggested a man under pressure. Was he the target of the murder hinted at in the letters, or was he orchestrating something himself? She needed to get closer to the manor, to the squire, and to Clara. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the square, the fate's centerpiece began, a masquerade dance on a wooden platform strung with fairy lights. Villagers donned homemade masks, some feathered, others painted with whimsical designs, and twirled to the band's lively waltz. Jane, still as Miss Primrose, declined invitations to dance, citing her old bones, but her eyes never left the crowd. Clara had joined the dance, her mask a delicate filigree of silver leaves, but her movements were stiff, her smile forced. The man from earlier, whom Jane now suspected was a relative or associate, reappeared, his mask a stark black domino that hid half his face. Their dance was more a negotiation than a celebration, their steps clipped, their hands barely touching. Jane edged closer, pretending to adjust her shawl, and caught fragments of their conversation over the music. "Can't keep hiding it," Clara said, her voice sharp. The man's reply was too low to hear, but his grip on her arm tightened, and she pulled away, her mask slipping slightly. Jane's heart quickened. This was no mere family spat. There was fear in Clara's eyes. And something else. Defiance. Guilt. The dance ended, and Clara vanished into the crowd. Jane followed at a distance, her steps slow and deliberate, her Miss Primrose persona intact. She passed a stall where a fortune-teller, draped in gaudy scarves, was reading tea leaves for giggling girls. Jane paused, feigning interest, and overheard a snippet from two women nearby. "Edmund's back, too," one said. "Clara's cousin. Always was a charmer, but there's something off about him now. Too many secrets. Edmund." Another name to add to her mental ledger. Jane moved on, her thoughts spinning like the dancers. Skirts. The letters had mentioned a web of deceit at Thornton Manor, and now she had threads to pull. Clara's tension with her uncle, the missing brooch, the squire's odd behaviour, and this Edmund, a charming cousin with secrets. The fate was a perfect cover, its chaos allowing her to observe without drawing attention. But it also masked the killer's movements. Whoever they were here, hidden among the masks and laughter. As twilight deepened, the fate wound down. Villagers began to drift home, their voices softer now, their energy spent. Jane lingered by the oak, her knitting resumed, her mind sifting through the day's observations. Clara's unease, the squire's absence from the fete, the whispers of theft and secret sit was a puzzle, and Jane loved puzzles, but this one felt different. The letter's playful tone belied a cold intent, and she sensed the killer was watching, testing, perhaps even enjoying the game. A sudden commotion broke her thoughts. A young boy, no more than 10, ran into the square, breathless. "It's the squire," he shouted. "He's at the manor gate, yelling about trespassers." The remaining villagers turned, murmuring, and Jane seized the opportunity. She tucked her knitting away and joined the small crowd heading toward Thornton Manor, her steps those of a curious newcomer, her mind those of a hunter. The manor loomed at the edge of the village, its stone walls half hidden by ivy, its iron gates glinting in the lantern light. Squire Thornton stood there, a tall, gaunt figure in a dark coat, his face flushed with anger. "Who's been on my land?" he bellowed, brandishing a walking stick. "I'll have the law on you." His gatekeeper, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, stood beside him, his eyes darting over the crowd. Jane stayed at the back, her head tilted as if merely intrigued. Clara was there too, standing apart, her mask gone, her face pale. The squire's tirade continued, but Jane noticed something odd. His hands trembled, and his eyes flicked toward Clara, not with anger, but with something closer to fear. The crowd dispersed, reassured by the gatekeeper's gruff promises to sort it out, but Jane lingered, watching as Clara approached her uncle, her voice low and urgent. The squire shook his head sharply and turned away, disappearing behind the gates. Jane returned to her rented cottage, a cozy nook on the village's edge, and sat by the fire, her knitting untouched. She drew a small notebook from her bag and began jotting notes in a cipher only she could read. Clara's fear, the squire's paranoia, the missing brooch, Edmund's secrets, the gatekeeper's watchfulness, each was a piece, but the picture was incomplete. No murder had occurred, not yet, but the air was thick with intent. She closed the notebook, her lips curving in a faint smile. Miss Primrose was invisible, a harmless old woman in a village of masks. But Jane Marple was wide awake, and the game was afoot. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Tea-House. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, curling around the ankles of villagers as they bustled toward the market square. Jane Marple, disguised as the unassuming Miss Primrose, adjusted, her prim spectacles and tucked a stray silver curl under her sensible hat. Her cover as a retired schoolteacher had settled over her like a well-worn shawl, and she moved through the village with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged. Today, her destination was Mrs. Puddleton's tea-house, a hub of gossip where the air was thick with secrets and the scent of freshly baked scones. The tea-house sat at the corner of High Street, its windows fogged with steam and its sign painted, teapot wreathed in roses swaying gently in the breeze. Jane pushed open the door, a bell jingling above her, and was greeted by a wave of warmth and chatter. The room was a cozy clutter of mismatched tables, each draped in lace, and chairs occupied by villagers sipping tea and exchanging tidbits. Mrs. Puddleton, a stout woman with a flour-dusted apron and a smile that hid a sharp tongue, presided, over the counter like a queen over her court. "Good morning, Miss Primrose," Mrs. Puddleton called, her voice cutting through the hum. "Your usual table by the window." Jane nodded, her smile demure. "If you please, Mrs. Puddleton, a pot of Earl Grey, and perhaps one of your delightful scones." She settled at her table, her back to the wall, her eyes free to roam. The tea-house was a perfect stage for observation, and Jane was a master at reading the players. To her left, two elderly women, Mrs. Finch and Miss Harrow, leaned close, their whispers sharp with speculation about Squire Thornton's recent moods. Across the room, a young couple giggled over a shared teacup, oblivious to the world, and near the counter, Clara Thornton, the squire's estranged niece, sat alone, her delicate hands wrapped around a steaming mug, her expression clouded. Jane's interest sharpened. Clara, with her auburn hair and guarded eyes, was a key figure in the cryptic letters that had drawn Jane to St. Mary Mead. The letters, slipped under her cottage door in the dead of night, spoke of betrayal and danger circling Thornton Manor. They hadn't named Clara outright, but Jane's instincts, honed by years of unraveling human follies, pointed to her as a pivot in the mystery. Today, Jane intended to get closer. She sipped her tea, the bergamot citrusy tang grounding her thoughts and let her gaze drift casually. Clara's posture was tense, her fingers tapping an uneven rhythm on her mug. Something was troubling her, and Jane suspected it wasn't just the village gossip about her uncle's missing heirloom silver locket, rumoured to be a family treasure, vanished from Thornton Manor a week ago. The whispers Jane had caught at the fete yesterday suggested the locket's theft was no simple crime, but a thread in a larger tapestry of deceit. Mrs. Puddleton bustled over with a scone, golden and crumbly, and set it before Jane. "You'll hear all sorts in here today, Miss Primrose," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Folk are all aflutter about that locket. Some say it's cursed. You know, old Mrs. Thornton, the squire's mother, swore it held the family's luck." Jane raised an eyebrow, feigning curiosity. "Cursed, my goodness, what a tale. Has there been any word on who might have taken it?" Mrs. Puddleton leaned closer, her eyes gleaming. "Not a soul knows for sure, but there's talk of a stranger skulking about the manor that night. Tall, they say, with a hat pulled low. And Clarowell, she's been quieter than usual, hasn't she? Some reckon she knows more than she's letting on." Jane nodded thoughtfully, filing the detail away. A stranger near the manor was new information, and it set her mind humming. "How intriguing," she murmured. "I do hope Clara's not too distressed by all this talk." Mrs. Puddleton snorted softly. "Distressed? That girl's got steel in her spine, mark my words. But she's not been herself since she came back to the village. Living with that uncle of hers can't be easy." As Mrs. Puddleton moved off to tend another customer, Jane took a bite of her scone, its buttery warmth a small comfort as she planned her next move. Clara was alone now, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her tea. This was Jane's moment. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and approached Clara's table with the hesitant air of a newcomer seeking companionship. "Miss Thornton, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm Miss Primrose, new to St. Mary Mead. Might I join you? I find myself rather at a loss for company this morning." Clara looked up, startled, her green eyes assessing Jane. For a moment, Jane thought she might refuse, but then Clara's lips curved into a small, polite smile. "Of course, Miss Primrose. Please, sit." Jane settled across from her, arranging her teacup with care. "This tea-house is quite charming," she began, her tone light. "I've only been in the village a short while, but I've heard such interesting stories." The fete was a delight, wasn't it? Clara's smile tightened. It was lively. St. Mary Mead does love its gatherings. "Oh, indeed," Jane said, her eyes crinkling with warmth, "though I couldn't help overhearing some talk about your uncle's manor. A missing locket, they say. It must be quite upsetting for your family." Clara's fingers stilled on her mug, and Jane noted the slight tremor in them. "It's just a trinket," Clara said, her voice carefully neutral. "Uncle's more upset about it than I am. He's been preoccupied lately." Jane tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. "Preoccupied? Oh, I do hope nothing's amiss. Moving to a new place, I find it so comforting to know one's neighbours are well." Clara hesitated, her gaze dropping to her tea. Jane waited, letting the silence stretch, knowing that sometimes stillness was the best prompt. Finally, Clara sighed. "Uncle's not been himself. He's always been particular, but lately he's been locking himself in his study, snapping at the staff. And then the locket went missing, and he's convinced it's some grand conspiracy." Jane's heart quickened, but her face remained serene. A conspiracy? How extraordinary. Has there been any clue about what happened to it? Clara's eyes flicked up, sharp and searching, as if weighing how much to share. There was a stranger scene near the manor that night, she said at last. One of the gardeners mentioned it, a man, tall, wearing a dark coat and hat. Number 1 recognized him. Uncle thinks he might be tied to the theft, but... She trailed off, her brow furrowing. But you're not so sure, Jane prompted gently. Clara's lips pressed into a thin line. I don't know what to think. Uncle's so paranoid now, he's even started questioning me, as if I'd steal from my own family. Her voice held a trace of bitterness, and Jane caught the glint of hurt in her eyes. Oh, my dear, Jane said, her tone warm with sympathy. That must be so difficult. Families can be so complicated, can't they? I remember my own niece, such a sweet girl, but we had our moments of misunderstanding. Clara softened slightly, the mention of family seeming to lower her guard. It's not just the locket, she admitted. Uncle's been getting these letters and signed full of vague threats. He won't show them to me, but I've seen him reading them, his face like thunder. I think they're why he's so on edge. Jane's pulse quickened. Letters. This aligned with the cryptic notes that had brought her here, though Clara's mention of them suggested they weren't exclusive to Jane's cottage door. Unsigned letters, she said, her voice tinged with just the right amount of curiosity. How unsettling. Do you think they're connected to the stranger? Clara shrugged, but her unease was palpable. Maybe I just wish Uncle would talk to me. Instead, he's got Edmund, that's my cousin, hovering about, acting like he's in charge. Edmund's charming when he wants to be, but I don't trust him. Jane filed away the name Edmund. A cousin, charming but untrustworthy in Clara's eyes. This was a new piece, and it fit neatly into her growing mental map. Family dynamics are so tricky, she said, her tone light, but her mind racing. This cousin of yours, is he staying at the manor? For now, Clara said, her voice tight. He showed up a month ago, claiming he wants to mend things with Uncle. But he's always been slippery, always has an angle. Jane nodded, her expression one of quiet understanding. I've known a few like that in my time. Tell me, my dear, do you feel safe at the manor, with all this going on? Clara's eyes widened, as if the question had caught her off guard. Safe, I suppose so. It's just unsettling, all of it. The letters, the theft, Uncle's moods, and that stranger. She shivered slightly, then forced a smile. But I'm probably making too much of it. Village gossip, you know how it is. Oh, I do, Jane said, her smile warm but her mind sharp. Gossip can be such a tangle, but sometimes there's a grain of truth in it. You're wise to stay cautious. The conversation paused as Mrs. Puddleton swept by, refilling their teapot with a flourish. Jane used the moment to study Clara's face, the faint lines of worry, the way her fingers twisted a napkin. The girl was frightened, but not just of her uncle's moods or the missing locket. There was something deeper, something she wasn't saying. As Mrs. Puddleton moved away, Jane leaned forward slightly. If you'll permit an old woman's advice, my dear, keep your eyes open. Strangers and letters and missing heirlooms, all rather curious, isn't it? If you ever need a listener, I'm only at Rose Cottage. Clara's smile was genuine this time, though it didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, Miss Primrose. That's kind of you. I might just take you up on that. They chatted a little longer about the weather and the village's upcoming church bazaar. But Jane's mind was elsewhere, sorting and sifting. The stranger by the manor, the unsigned letters, Edmund's sudden return, Clara's Enos's. Was a puzzle with too many pieces still missing. But Jane felt a quiet satisfaction. Her disguise as Miss Primrose had won Clara's trust, and that trust was a door to more answers. As Clara excused herself to leave, Jane lingered, her tea now cold. She pulled a small notebook from her bag and, under the guise of jotting a shopping list, sketched a mental map of her suspects. Squire Thornton, paranoid and secretive. Clara, caught in the middle. Edmund, the slippery cousin. And the stranger, a shadow in a dark coat. The locket's theft was no isolated act, it was a signal. A crack in the facade of St. Mary Mead's sleepy charm. The tea-house buzzed around her, voices rising and falling like a tide. Jane caught snatches of talk Mrs. Finch, speculating about the stranger's origins, a farmer grumbling about Thornton's latest land dispute. Each fragment was a thread, and Jane was already weaving them together. She closed her notebook, her lips curving into a faint smile. The game was afoot, and Miss Primrose was precisely where she needed to be and seen. Unremarkable and dangerously close to the truth. She paid her bill, leaving a generous tip for Mrs. Puddleton, and stepped back into the misty morning. The village stretched before her, its secrets hidden behind lace curtains and polite smiles. Jane adjusted her hat, her eyes bright with purpose. The stranger's identity was her next target, and she had a feeling the manor held more clues than it let on. For now, she was content. Her disguise was holding, her net was tightening, and the whispers in the tea-house had given her just the start she needed. Chapter 3. The disguised guest. The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp edge, scented with late summer roses and the faint temps of wood smoke from a distant bonfire. Miss Jane Marple, cloaked in the unassuming guise of Miss Primrose, adjusted her spectacles and smoothed the modest grey frock she'd chosen for the occasion. Her invitation to Thornton Manor for dinner had come unexpectedly, delivered by a nervous footman who'd seemed more preoccupied with his own thoughts than the message he carried. Jane, with her knack for reading the unspoken, noted his fidgeting fingers and the way his eyes darted toward the manor's looming silhouette. Something was amiss in that grand house, and she intended to uncover it as she approached the manor. Its ivy-clad walls glowed faintly under the moonlight, the tall windows casting golden rectangles onto the gravel drive. The house was a study in contrasts, elegant yet weathered, imposing yet secretive. Jane's lips twitched into a faint smile. She'd seen many such houses in her time, each hiding its own tangle of human frailties. Tonight, she'd play the part of Miss Primrose, the retired schoolteacher with a penchant for birdwatching and a harmless curiosity about local history. It was a role she'd crafted with care, one that allowed her to fade into the background while her sharp mind catalogued every gesture, every word. That heavy oak door creaked open, revealing a butler whose stiff posture and pinched expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Primrose," he intoned, his voice as dry as old parchment. "The squire awaits you in the drawing-room." Jane nodded demurely, clutching her embroidered reticule, which held nothing more incriminating than a handkerchief and a small notebook. She followed the butler through a dimly lit hall, its walls lined with portraits of stern-faced Thorntons glaring down as if judging her worth. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and beeswax, but beneath it lingered something less tangible, tension that seemed to hum in the very walls. The drawing-room was a blaze of warmth and light, with a chandelier casting prisms. Across the damask wallpaper, Squire Thornton stood by the fireplace, a broad-shouldered man with a florid complexion and a moustache that seemed to bristle with its own opinions. His eyes, however, betrayed a nervousness that his booming voice tried to mask. "Miss Primrose, delighted you could join us," he said, striding forward to shake her hand with a vigor that felt more performative than genuine. "Thank you, Squire," Jane replied, her voice soft and slightly tremulous, as befitted a woman of Miss Primrose's timid demeanour. "It's such a treat to see Thornton Manor. I've heard so much about its history." The room was already buzzing with guests, their voices rising and falling like a poorly tuned orchestra. Clara Thornton, the squire's estranged niece, stood near a window, her auburn hair catching the candlelight. She wore a green silk dress that seemed to wear her rather than the other way round, and her expression was one of guarded defiance. Beside her, Edmund Thornton, the squire's cousin and heir apparent, leaned against a bookcase, his charm as polished as the silverware. His dark eyes flicked over Jane with a fleeting curiosity before returning to Clara, who pointedly ignored him. Jane took her place among the guests, her eyes darting from face to face. There was Mrs. Harrow, the vicar's wife, whose incessant chatter about the church bazaar masked a keen ear for gossip. Mr. Langley, a local solicitor with a penchant for port, was already red-faced and expounding on land disputes. And then there was Miss Evelyn Crane, a spinster of indeterminate age whose sharp tongue and sharper gaze suggested she missed nothing. Jane filed each observation away, her mind a ledger of motives and mannerisms. Dinner was announced, and the guests filed into the dining room, where a long mahogany table gleamed under a constellation of candelabras. Jane was seated between Mr. Langley and Miss Crane, a position she welcomed for its potential to yield unguarded remarks. As the first course, a delicate consomme, was served, she leaned toward Miss Crane, her tone light. "I hear Thornton Manor has quite the collection of artifacts. Have you seen the famous sapphire brooch?" Miss Crane's eyes narrowed, as if weighing whether Jane's question was as innocent as it seemed. "The brooch? Oh, it's been locked. Away since that business last month. Vanished, they say, though I'd wager it's still somewhere in this house." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "The squire's been beside himself ever since." Jane nodded, her expression one of polite surprise. "How dreadful. Such a loss must weigh heavily." "More than you'd think," Miss Crane said, her lips pursing. "Some say it's cursed. That brooch brings nothing but trouble." Across the table, Clara's spoon clattered against her bowl, drawing a sharp glance from Edmund. The squire, at the head of the table, cleared his throat and launched into a monologue about the manor's renovations, his voice loud enough to drown out any further whispers. Jane listened, her attention split between his words and the undercurrents rippling through the room. Clara's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white. Edmund's smile was too fixed, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the tablecloth. Something was brewing, and Jane felt the familiar thrill of being close to its heart. Then, without warning, the room plunged into darkness. The candles flickered out, and the electric lights overhead sputtered and died, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight through the tall windows. A collective gasp rose from the guests, followed by a murmur of confusion. Jane's pulse quickened, but she remained still, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. A shadow moved near the far end of the tabula figure, slipping silently toward the door that led to the manor's east wing. It was too deliberate to be a servant, too stealthy to be innocent. Drat this old wiring, the squire bellowed, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Jenkins, see to the fuses." The butler's footsteps echoed as he hurried out, and within moments the lights flickered back on, bathing the room in their warm glow. Jane's gaze swept the table. Everyone was in their place, except Edmund, whose chair was slightly askew, as if he'd just returned to it. His smile was as charming as ever, but Jane caught the faintest sheen of sweat on his brow. "Terribly sorry about that," the squire said, mopping his own forehead with a napkin. "This old pile has its quirks." "No harm done," Jane said, brightly, her tone that of Miss Primrose's cheerful naivety. "It rather adds to the manor's charm, don't you think?" Clara shot her a grateful look, as if relieved by the change of subject, but Edmund's eyes lingered on Jane for a moment too long. She met his gaze with a bland smile, her heart racing. He couldn't know who she was, not yet, but she'd seen enough to mark him as a man with secrets. The rest of the dinner passed without incident, though the atmosphere remained taut, like a violin string stretched to breaking. Jane made small talk with Mr. Langley, who rambled about property law, and Miss Crane, who hinted darkly at goings-on in the village. Clara spoke little, her eyes flitting between her uncle and Edmund, while the squire grew increasingly flushed, his laughter too loud, his gestures too broad. As the guests rose to retire to the drawing-room for coffee, Jane lingered, feigning a need to adjust her shawl. Her eyes scanned the dining-room, noting the door through which the shadow had slipped. It led to the east wing, where, according to village gossip, the squire's study was located, a room few were allowed to enter. Jane's fingers itched to explore, but she knew better than to act rashly. Patience was her greatest ally. In the drawing-room, the guests dispersed into small knots of conversation. Jane positioned herself near a window where she could observe, without being drawn into the fray. Clara stood alone by a pianoforte, her fingers tracing its keys without playing. Jane approached, her movements slow and deliberate, as if drawn by the instrument's beauty. "Such a lovely piece," she said, nodding at the pianoforte. "Do you play, Miss Thornton?" Clara started, then offered a small smile. "Not as much as I'd like. It's been a difficult year." "I can imagine," Jane said, her voice gentle. "A house like this must hold so many memories, not all of them happy." Clara's eyes flickered with something grief, perhaps, or suspicion. "You're very perceptive, Miss Primrose." "Oh, I'm just an old schoolteacher," Jane said with a self-deprecating laugh. "But I do love a good story. Thornton Manor seems full of them." Clara hesitated, then leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Be careful what stories you chase here, Miss Primrose. Some of them have sharp edges." Before Jane could reply, Edmund appeared at Clara's side, his smile as smooth as polished glass. "Clara, you mustn't monopolize our guest. Miss Primrose, would you care for a turn about the room? The manor's portraits are quite the sight." Jane inclined her head, sensing an opportunity. "I'd be delighted." As they strolled, Edmund played the perfect host, pointing out the stern visages of Thornton ancestors and recounting their exploits with a practiced charm. But Jane noticed the way his eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if expecting someone nor something to emerge. She kept her questions light, asking about the manor's history, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the evening's clues, the shadow in the dark, Edmund's absence during the outage, Clara's cryptic warning. As the evening drew to a close, Jane bid her farewells, her mind alight with possibilities. The squire's nervous bluster, Clara's guarded sorrow, Edmund's polished secrecy was a tapestry of motives, and somewhere within it lay the thread of a crime. The power outage had been no accident, she was certain, and the shadowy figure had been no phantom. Someone in Thornton Manor was playing a dangerous game, and Jane, as Miss Primrose, was perfectly positioned to watch it unfold. She stepped into the cool night air, her breath visible in the moonlight. The manor loomed behind her, its windows like eyes watching her departure. Jane's heart thrummed with quiet triumph. Her disguise had held, her presence unnoticed by all but the one who mattered, the killer, who might yet reveal themselves through a single, fatal misstep. Chapter 4. The Locked Study. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a gossamer veil that softened its edges but sharpened Jane Marple's senses. As Miss Primrose, the retired schoolteacher with a penchant for knitting and a deceptively mild demeanour, she strolled toward Thornton Manor, her sensible shoes tapping a deliberate rhythm on the path. The invitation to the manor had come unexpectedly, a casual remark from Squire Thornton at the village fete about her supposed love for rare books. Jane had planted the seed herself, dropping hints about her passion for antiquarian literature during a chat with the squire's housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers, whose tongue wagged faster than a metronome now. The bait had been taken, and Jane was to join a small group touring the manor's library. Her real target, however, was the locked study, whispered about in the tea-house as the squire's private sanctum. The manor loomed ahead, its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows exuding an air of weathered grandeur. Jane adjusted her spectacles, which were more prop than necessity, and smoothed her lavender shawl. Her disguise was a masterpiece of understated camouflage, a dowdy cardigan, a brooch shaped like a primrose, and a perpetually curious expression that invited trust but deflected scrutiny. As she approached the wrought iron gates, she noted the gardener, a wiry man named Higgs, pruning roses with a distracted air. His glance lingered on her a fraction too long, and Jane filed it away, her mind already weaving a tapestry of motives and opportunities inside. The manor was a labyrinth of polished oak and faded tapestries. Mrs. Danvers, her face a map of pinched disapproval, led Jane and two other guests, a local historian, Mr. Pym, and a young botanist, Miss Eliza Renterward, the library. Mr. Pym droned on about medieval manuscripts, his voice a monotonous hum, while Miss Wren clutched a notebook, her eyes darting to every corner as if cataloguing the manor's flora. Jane smiled benignly, her hands folded over her knitting bag, which concealed a small notebook of her own. The library was magnificent, its shelves groaning under leather-bound tomes, but Jane's attention was elsewhere. A heavy mahogany door, tucked behind a velvet curtain, bore a brass lock that gleamed with recent use. The study, Squire Thornton's private retreat, Mrs. Danvers said, her tone clipped as she gestured toward the door. He's particular about it. No one's allowed inside without his say-so. Oh, how intriguing, Jane said, her voice a perfect blend of awe and innocence. Does he keep rare first editions in there? I once read a folio of Shakespeare in a private collection, quite thrilling. Mrs. Danvers hesitated, her pride in the manor warring with her duty to deflect. The squire's a collector, yes, but the study's off-limits. Now, if you'll follow me to the incunabula. Forgive an old woman's curiosity, Jane interrupted, her smile disarming. But is it true he has a caxton? I'd give my best knitting needles to glimpse one. Mr. Pym's eyes lit. Up a caxton? Surely not. The squire would have mentioned it at the Historical Society. double quotes, Mrs. Danvers bristled. The squire doesn't share his treasures with just anyone. Now, come along. Jane nodded, feigning disappointment, but her pulse quickened. The housekeeper's defensiveness confirmed the study's importance. As the group moved toward a display of illuminated manuscripts, Jane lagged behind, pretending to admire a portrait of a Jawthornton ancestor. Her fingers brushed the curtain, and she caught a faint whiff of tobacco and wax polish emanating from the study door. Someone had been there recently. She made a mental note to return. The tour dragged on, with Mr. Pym's lectures growing ever more tedious. Jane seized her chance when Miss Wren dropped her notebook, scattering papers across the floor. As Mrs. Danvers and Mr. Pym stooped to help, Jane slipped behind the curtain. The lock was a simple pin and tumbler, child's play for someone who'd once picked a vicarage lock to retrieve a misplaced parish register. From her knitting bag, she produced a hairpin, its end discreetly bent for such purposes. Within seconds, the lock clicked softly, and Jane eased the door open, her heart steady despite the risk. The study was a stark contrast to the manor's opulence. A single desk, cluttered with papers, dominated the room, flanked by a worn leather chair and a brass lamp. Shelves held ledgers, not books, and a narrow window let in a sliver of grey light. Jane moved swiftly, her eyes scanning for anything out of place. The desk drawer was locked, but another hairpin made short work of it. Inside, she found a ledger, its pages filled with meticulous entries in the squire's spidery hand. Payments, large and irregular, caught her items to unnamed recipients, dated over the past 6 months. One entry, marked LW, stood out £500, paid 3 days before the heirloom's disappearance. Jane's fingers traced the page, her mind racing. LW could be Lydia Wren, the mysterious newcomer, or perhaps Leonard Walsh, the squire's old business partner, now rumoured to be bankrupt. The amounts were too substantial for household expenses, and the secrecy suggested something illicit. She flipped to a later page, finding a cryptic note scrawled in the margin. C. Must not know, Clara, the squire's niece. Jane's thoughts were interrupted by a faint creak from the hall. Her breath caught, but years of practice kept her calm. She closed the ledger, returned it to the drawer, and locked it. Her movements silent and precise. The creak came again, closer now. Jane glanced around, spotting a heavy curtain by the window. She slipped behind it, her slight frame barely disturbing the fabric. The door opened, and heavy footsteps entered, too heavy for Mrs. Danvers. Through a gap in the curtain, Jane glimpsed Squire Thornton himself, his face etched with worry. He carried a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper, which he tucked into a hidden panel behind a bookshelf. Jane's eyes narrowed. The panel was cleverly disguised, its edges flush with the wood. Thornton hesitated, glancing over his shoulder, then left, locking the door behind him. Jane waited, counting to 60 to ensure he was gone. Emerging, she examined the panel but didn't touch it, too risky without knowing its mechanism. She memorized its location, her mind already plotting her next move. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a faint scratch on the desk, fresh and deliberate, as if someone had carved it with a knife. It was a single letter, E. Edmund, Clara's cousin. The plot thickened. Slipping out of the study, Jane relocked the door and rejoined the group just as Mrs. Danvers was herding them toward the exit. "Miss Primrose, you wandered off," the housekeeper said, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, I was captivated by that portrait," Jane said, gesturing vaguely. Such a stern fellow. A Thornton, I presume. Mrs. Danvers softened, launching into a lecture about the family lineage. Jane nodded, her thoughts elsewhere. The ledger, the parcel, the scratch, they were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. As the group stepped into the Manners Gardens, Jane caught sight of Edmund near the stables, his posture tense as he spoke to a man in a dark coat. The stranger's face was obscured, but his gestures were sharp, almost threatening. Jane's lips curved slightly. Another thread to pull. That evening, in her rented cottage, Jane sat by a crackling fire, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. Her notebook lay open, filled with precise diagrams and observations. The ledger's entries suggested blackmail or bribery, but to what end? The squire's nervousness, the hidden parcel, and Edmund's secretive meeting pointed to a conspiracy, but the motive was unclear. Was the heirloom's theft a distraction, or the heart of the matter? And who was L.W.? Jane leaned back, her eyes half closed. The village was a chessboard, and she was a grand master playing blindfolded. Each move her feigned interest in books, her subtle questions, her careful eavesdropping had brought her closer to the truth. But the creak outside the study door lingered in her mind, a reminder that someone was watching. The killer, perhaps, or an accomplice. Her disguise had held so far, but she sensed the game was about to escalate. As the firelight danced, Jane sketched a mental map of the manor, marking the study's panel and the scratch on the desk. She felt a quiet thrill, the kind that came from unraveling secrets hidden in plain sight. The locked study had yielded its first clue, and though danger loomed, Jane Marple was in her element. Miss Primrose, the unassuming schoolteacher, would return to Thornton Manor, her eyes sharper than ever, her disguise a perfect shield. The truth was close, she could feel it, like the tug of a well-stitched seam. Chapter 5. The Midnight Intruder. The moon hung low over St. Mary Mead, a silver crescent casting a faint glow across the village's thatched roofs and winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple, still cloaked in the guise of Miss Primrose, the retired schoolteacher, sat by the window of her rented cottage. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a rhythmic counterpoint to the stillness of the night. The village was asleep, or so it seemed, but Jane's mind was wide awake, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle she'd gathered since her arrival. Her days as Miss Primrose had been meticulously crafted. She wore a plain tweed skirt, a high-necked blouse, and a pair of spectacles that sat low on her nose, giving her an air of harmless curiosity. The villagers had accepted her without question, charmed by her tales of teaching Latin to fidgety schoolgirls and her feigned interest in local gossip, but beneath the facade, Jane's sharp eyes missed nothing, not the squire's nervous tick at dinner, nor Clara's guarded glances, nor the shadow of a stranger slipping through Thornton Manor's grounds. Tonight, she sensed, was no ordinary night. The air held a charge, like the moment before a storm breaks. Jane set her knitting aside and adjusted the laced curtain, peering into the darkness. The manor loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the sky. Earlier that day, she'd overheard a snippet of conversation at the village shopper-groundskeeper, muttering about a broken gate near the manor's orchard, never locked properly, he'd grumbled, unaware of the keen-eared Miss Primrose lingering by the tinned biscuits. That gate, Jane thought, was a weak point, an invitation for someone bold or desperate enough to exploit it. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, midnight. The village was silent, save for the occasional hoot of an owl. Jane slipped on a dark shawl, tucking her white hair beneath a plain cap. Miss Primrose would never be seen wandering at such an hour, but Jane Marple was no stranger to the art of moving unseen. She stepped outside, her soft-soled shoes silent on the cobblestones, and made her way toward the manor, keeping to the shadows of the hedgerows. The night air was cool, scented with damp earth and late-blooming roses. Jane moved with purpose, her senses attuned to every rustle and snap. She reached the orchard gate, its iron frame sagging on rusted hinges. It creaked faintly as she pushed it open, just enough to slip through. The manor's grounds sprawled. Before her, a maze of ancient oaks and manicured lawns. She crouched low, her heart steady despite the thrill of the moment. Years of unraveling human nature's darker threads had taught her to trust her instincts, and tonight they whispered of secrets waiting to be uncovered. A flicker of movement caught her eye near the manor's west wing, where ivy clung to the stone like a shroud. A figure, cloaked in darkness, moved with the cautious grace of someone who knew they shouldn't be there. Jane's breath caught, but she remained still, her body pressed against the rough bark of an oak. The figure paused, glancing around, then darted toward a low window half hidden by a rhododendron bush. The moonlight glinted off something metallic, a tool, perhaps, or a key. Jane's mind raced. The figure's build was familiar, though the darkness obscured their face. She thought of Edmund, Clara's charming but secretive cousin, whose easy smile at the manor's dinner had never reached his eyes. His movements then had been calculated, his laughter a touch too loud, as if masking something deeper. Could this be him? Or was it the mysterious stranger the tea-house gossip had mentioned, seen lurking near the manor the night the heirloom vanished? She crept closer, her steps silent on the dew-soaked grass. The figure knelt by the window, working at the latch with practiced ease. A soft click echoed in the stillness, and the window swung inward. Jane's pulse quickened. This was no casual trespasser. This was someone with a purpose, someone who knew the manor's vulnerabilities. She considered her options. Confronting the intruder was out of the question. Miss Primrose was a frail schoolteacher, not a vigilante, but observation, Jane knew, was her sharpest weapon. The figure slipped inside, leaving the window ajar. Jane waited, counting to 10, then approached. The rhododendron's leaves brushed her shawl as she peered through the gap. The room beyond was dark, but she could make out shelves lined with books and a heavy desk, the manor's library, adjacent to the locked study she'd explored the day before. A faint glow flickered, as if the intruder had lit a small lantern. Jane strained to listen, catching the soft rustle of papers and the occasional creak of floorboards. She glanced around, ensuring no one else was near, then edged closer to the window. The intruder's movements were deliberate, searching for something specific. Jane's mind flashed to the ledger she'd found in the study, its cryptic entries hinting at payments to an unknown party. Was this what the intruder sought? Or was it something more tangible, like the missing heirloom sapphire brooch the village gossips claimed, worth a small fortune? A sudden noise, a sharp snap, like a twig breaking, made Jane freeze. She ducked behind the bush, her heart pounding. The sound had come from the orchard, not far from the gate. Another figure, or just a fox, prowling for scraps. She waited, her breath shallow, but no one appeared. The intruder inside seemed oblivious, their lantern casting fleeting shadows on the walls. Jane's curiosity warred with caution. She could return to her cottage, safe in her disguise, and piece together her observations by morning. but the opportunity to identify the intruder might not come again. She made her decision. Easing the window open just enough to slip through, she climbed inside. Her movements as silent as a cat's. The library smelled of old leather and dust, and the air was thick with the weight of secrets. She crouched behind a heavy armchair, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The intruder was at the desk, rifling through drawers. Jane caught a glimpse of their profile-sharp cheekbones, a lock of dark hair falling over their brow. It was Edmund, she was certain now, recognizing the angle of his jaw from the dinner party. He muttered to himself, his voice low but laced with frustration. Where is it? It has to be here. Jane's mind worked quickly. Edmund's presence confirmed her suspicions of his involvement. But what was he after? The ledger, the brooch, or something else entirely, something she hadn't yet uncovered? She noted his anxious glances toward the door, as if expecting interruption. Whatever he sought, he was running out of time. Edmund pulled a small package from the drawer, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. He tucked it into his coat, extinguished the lantern, and moved toward the window. Jane pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her heart steady despite the risk. As he climbed out, she caught a glimpse of his face in the moonlight pale, tense, his eyes darting like a hunted animal's. He didn't see her. He didn't know Miss Primrose, the harmless schoolteacher, was watching his every move. Once he was gone, Jane waited, counting the seconds until she was sure he wouldn't return. She emerged from her hiding place and approached the desk. The drawer he'd opened was still ajar, revealing a jumble of papers, bills, letters, nothing immediately incriminating. But Jane's instincts told her the package was key. She memorized its size, its shape, the way Edmund had handled it with care. Whatever it contained, it was worth risking a midnight break-in. She slipped back through the window, closing it carefully behind her. The night was still, the manor's grounds undisturbed. As she made her way back to the orchard gate, her mind buzzed with new connections. Edmund's involvement was no surprise, but his desperation suggested a larger plan, one that went beyond a stolen heirloom. Was he working alone, or was someone else pulling the strings? The stranger from the tea-house gossip, perhaps, or another player she hadn't yet identified. Back in her cottage, Jane lit a single candle and sat at her small writing desk. She opened her notebook, its pages filled with neat, precise notes disguised as lesson plans for Latin verbs. To any curious villager, it was the work of a retired schoolteacher. To Jane, it was a map of motives, a catalogue of glances and whispers. She added tonight's observations: Edmund, midnight, library, brown paper package, anxious demeanor. She sketched the package's dimensions, noting its weight from the way he'd carried it. As the candle flickered, Jane leaned back, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead's quiet facades. Every village had its secrets, she knew, hidden behind lace curtains and polite smiles. Edmund's actions tonight were a piece of the puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. The squire's erratic behavior, Clara's fear, the missing heirloom, the ledger's cryptic payments, all threads in a tapestry she was only beginning to understand. She smiled faintly, satisfied with her night's work. Her disguise as Miss Primrose had held her presence unnoticed by the village and its schemers. But the killer, she sensed, was not so easily fooled. Someone was watching, waiting for a misstep. Jane blew out the candle, the room plunging into darkness. By dawn, she'd be Miss Primrose again, sipping tea and nodding at gossip. But tonight, she was Jane Marple, one step closer to the truth. The puzzle was far from solved, but Jane thrived on the challenge. As she slipped into bed, the faintest thrill ran through her. The game was afoot, and she was ready for the next move. Chapter 6. The poisoned pen. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, curling around the ankles of early risers who shuffled toward the village square. Miss Jane Marple, disguised as the unassuming Miss Primrose, adjusted her spectacles and pulled her shawl tighter, her breath visible in the crisp air. Her grey hair, neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, gave her the air of a retired schoolteacher, but her sharp eyes missed nothing, not the hurried glance of the postman, nor the way Mrs. Hattie's dog tugged toward the alley behind the tea-house. Jane's lips curved slightly, a private acknowledgment of the village's pulse, which beat with secrets as surely as it did with gossip. She stepped into the Rose and Crown tea-house, the bell above the door jingling softly, the scent of scones and Darjeeling enveloped her, and she chose a corner table near the window, where she could observe without being conspicuous. Her notebook, disguised as a recipe journal, lay open before her, filled with cryptic shorthand only she could decipher. To the villagers, she was Miss Primrose, a harmless spinster with a penchant for herbal teas and quiet chatter. To Jane, every interaction was a thread in the tapestry of her investigation. The tea-house buzzed with the usual crowd, Mrs. Hattie gossiping about the vicar's new sermon, Mr. Grayson, the butcher, grumbling about rising flour prices, and Clara Thornton, Squire Thornton's niece, who sat alone at a table by the fireplace, her face pale and drawn. Jane's interest sharpened. Clara had been the subject of whispers since the heirloom sapphire brooch vanished from Thornton Manor. The anonymous letters, which had drawn Jane to St. Mary Mead, hinted at darker deeds, and Clara's name appeared in them too often for coincidence. Jane sipped her chamomile tea, her gaze flickering to Clara. The young woman's fingers twisted a napkin into knots, her eyes darting to the door each time it opened. Jane noted the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders hunched as if bracing for a blow. Something had shifted since their last conversation, when Clara had spoken of her uncle's erratic behavior. Jane sensed a new fear in her, one that went beyond family quarrels. Miss Primrose, dear, more tea. Mrs. Lavender, the tea-house owner, hovered with a steaming pot, her round face beaming. "Thank you, Mrs. Lavender," Jane replied, her voice soft and slightly quavering, perfect for her disguise. "It's such a comfort on a chilly morning." As Mrs. Lavender poured, Jane leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Is Miss Thornton quite well? She seems troubled today." Mrs. Lavender glanced at Clara, her smile fading. "Poor dear, she's had a shock, I hear. Another of those dreadful letters arrived this morning, accusing her of all sorts. It's got the whole village talking." Jane's pulse quickened, but her expression remained one of mild concern. "Letters, how distressing. Do they say who's sending them?" "No, not a clue. Anonymous, every one. Clara showed me the latest horrible stuff, saying she's plotting against her uncle. Can you imagine? Sweet Clara, who wouldn't hurt a fly." Jane nodded, her mind racing. The letters were escalating, and their timing was no accident. Whoever was behind them wanted Clara isolated, perhaps to deflect suspicion from themselves. "I'll have a word with her," Jane said, rising. A bit of company might lift her spirits. She approached Clara's table, her steps deliberate, her smile warm but not intrusive. "Miss Thornton, may I join you? I find these autumn mornings rather lonely without a friend to share them." Clara looked up, startled, then managed a faint smile. "Oh, Miss Primrose, of course, Please, sit. Jane settled across from her, noting the faint tremor in Clara's hands as she pushed the napkin aside. You seem out of sorts, my dear. Is something troubling you? Clara hesitated, her green eyes searching Jane's face. The older woman's gentle demeanor, carefully cultivated, seemed to ease her guard. It's those letters, she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. Another came today. It says I'm planning to harm Uncle Henry. It's absurd, but people are starting to believe it. Jane tilted her head, her expression one of quiet sympathy. How dreadful. Have you any idea who might be sending them? Clara shook her head, her auburn curls catching the firelight. None, but I think it's Edmund, my cousin. He's been so strange lately, always watching me, asking questions about Uncle's will. And he's been meeting someone in secret. I saw him by the old mill last night, talking to a woman I didn't recognize. Jane's interest sharpened, but she kept her tone light. Edmund, he seems such a charming young man. But appearances can be deceiving, can't they? Tell me, what did you see at the mill? Clara leaned closer, her voice dropping. It was late, almost midnight. I couldn't sleep, so I took a walk. I saw Edmund by the river, handing something to a woman in a dark cloak. They were whispering, and he looked nervous. I didn't stay long. I didn't want them to see me. Jane's mind catalogued the details. Edmund, the secretive cousin, a mysterious woman, a late-night exchange. It fit the pattern she'd begun to trace, but it wasn't enough. She needed more. You were wise to stay hidden, she said, but let's not jump to conclusions. Perhaps we could have a cup of tea and think this through together. Clara nodded, a flicker of relief crossing her face. Jane signaled to Mrs. Lavender, who bustled over with a fresh pot of Earl Grey. As she poured, Jane's eyes caught a glint on the saucer of faint dusting of white powder, barely noticeable against the porcelain. Her heart skipped. It could be sugar or flour from a scone, but Jane's instinct screamed otherwise. She reached for the teacup, her movements casual, and tipped it slightly, letting a few grains spill onto her handkerchief. Oh, how clumsy of me, she said, dabbing at the saucer with a laugh. Mrs. Lavender, might we have a fresh cup? This one's a bit dusty. Of course, Miss Primrose. Mrs. Lavender hurried off, oblivious to the significance of the moment. Jane folded the handkerchief and slipped it into her pocket, her mind racing. The powder could be nothing, or it could be everything. She needed to get it to the chemist in Upper Mead, a discreet man who owed her a favor from a past case. But first, she had to keep Clara talking. Tell me about Edmund, Jane said, her tone conversational. Has he always been close to your uncle? Clara sipped her new tea, her hands steadier now. Not really. He only came back to St. Mary Mead a few months ago, after years away. Uncle Henry took him in, said family should stick together, but Edmund's changed. He's colder, always talking about money, the estate, what happens if Uncle dies. It makes me uneasy. Jane nodded, her mind fitting pieces together. Edmund's return, the missing heirloom. The anonymous letters all pointed to a plan, one that likely involved framing Clara. But the powder suggested something more immediate, more dangerous. Poison, perhaps, meant to incapacitate or worse. Jane's disguise as Miss Primrose had kept her invisible, but she felt the killer's gaze tightening, as if they sensed an unseen threat. The tea-house door jingled, and Jane's eyes flicked up. Edmund Thornton himself stepped inside, his dark coat dusted with mist. He was tall, with sharp features and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He scanned the room, his gaze lingering on Clara before settling on Jane. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jane felt a chill not of fear, but of recognition. He was assessing her, just as she was assessing him. "Clara, there you are," Edmund said, striding over. His voice was smooth, but Jane caught the edge beneath it. "I've been looking for you. Uncle's asking for you at the manor." Clara stiffened, her fingers tightening on her cup. "I'll come later. I'm having tea with Miss Primrose." Edmund's smile tightened. "Miss Primrose, is it? Always a pleasure." He inclined his head, but his eyes lingered, searching for something Jane couldn't quite name. "The pleasure's mine," Jane replied, her voice airy. "Such a charming village. I do enjoy meeting its residents." Edmund's gaze flickered, as if testing her words for hidden meaning. Then he nodded and left, the door jingling in his wake. Jane's heart beat faster, not from fear, but from the thrill of the chase. He suspected something, but her disguise held firm. "For now," Clara Jane said softly, "do be careful. These letters, they're meant to unsettle you, perhaps to provoke a mistake. Stay close to those you trust." Clara nodded, her eyes wide. "Thank you, Miss Primrose. You're kinder than most here." Jane smiled, but her mind was elsewhere, already planning her next move. The powder in her pocket was a lead, one she couldn't ignore. As Clara finished her tea and left for the manor, Jane lingered, her notebook open. She sketched a quick diagram, Edmund at the center, lines branching to Clara, the mysterious woman, the heirloom, and now the powder. The puzzle was taking shape, but it was far from complete. That afternoon, Jane slipped out of the village, her shawl wrapped tightly against the wind. The chemist in Upper Mead was a half-hour's walk, and she used the time to think. The letters were a distraction, meant to cast suspicion on Clara, but the powder suggested a bolder move. If it was poison, as she suspected, someone was planning to act soon. Edmund was the obvious suspect, but the woman by the mill complicated things. An accomplice, a mastermind. Jane's mind spun with possibilities, each one tested and discarded until she reached the chemist's shop. Mr. Hargreaves. The chemist was a wiry man with a penchant for discretion. He greeted her with a nod, recognizing the Miss Primrose. He'd met once before. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" Jane produced the handkerchief, unfolding it carefully. "I found this in my garden," she lied, her voice quavering just enough to sell the story. "I thought it might be some pest powder, but I'd rather be sure. Could you tell me what it is?" Hargreaves took the sample, his brow furrowing as he examined it under a magnifying glass. "Odd texture," he muttered. He sprinkled a pinch into a vial, added a reagent, and watched it fizz. "This isn't pest powder, Miss Primrose. It's a toxin. Could make someone very ill or worse if ingested over time." Jane's heart sank, though her face remained placid. Goodness, how alarming. Any idea where it might come from? Hargreaves hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I sold something like this recently. A young man said it was for a chemistry project. Didn't give his name, but he had a Thornton Manor crest on his glove." Jane's mind snapped to Edmund. The crest wasn't proof, but it was close. "Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves," she said, tucking the handkerchief away. "You've been most helpful." As she walked back to St. Mary Mead, the wind carried the first hints of rain. Jane's thoughts churned. The powder confirmed her suspicions. Someone was planning to poison Squire Thornton, and Clara was the intended scapegoat. Edmund's late-night meeting, his evasiveness, the toxinol pointed to him. But the woman by the mill was a wild card, one Jane needed to identify. Back in her cottage, Jane sat by the fire, her notebook open. She wrote in her shorthand, Edmund toxin purchase, mill meeting, woman accomplice, motive unclear, claret Agatha frame, powder intended for Thornton. She leaned back, satisfied with her progress, but wary. The killer was moving, and she was close to close, perhaps. Her disguise as Miss Primrose had fooled everyone, but the killer's instincts were sharpening. She could feel it in Edmund's glance, in the weight of the village's secrets. The rain began to fall, tapping against the window. Jane closed her notebook and pocketed the handkerchief. Tomorrow she'd watch Edmund closer, perhaps trail him to the mill. For now, she'd thwarted a potential poisoning by spotting the powder. It was a small victory, but enough to keep her one step ahead. As she sipped her tea, she smiled faintly, her mind already racing toward the next connection in the web of St. Mary Mead's secrets. Chapter 7. The Chemist's Clutha. Morning sun spilled through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's rented cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns on the worn oak floor. As Miss Primrose, the retired schoolteacher, Jane adjusted her spectacles and smoothed her tweed skirt, her mind already racing with the threads of the mystery she was unraveling. The powder she had pocketed from Clara's spilled teacup sat in a small glass vial on her dresser, its faint greenish hue catching the light like a whispered secret. She had thwarted a potential poisoning, but the question of who and why loomed larger than ever. Jane sipped her tea, the porcelain cup warm against her palms, and reviewed her mental notes. Edmund's anxious glances in the manor's grounds, the cryptic ledger entries, and now this toxinate all pointed to a conspiracy tightening around Squire Thornton and his niece, Clara. But she needed proof, something tangible to pin down. Edmund's role, the local chemist, Mr. Hargreaves, was her next step. A man of precision and quiet pride, he was known for his meticulous records and encyclopedic knowledge of compounds. If anyone could identify the powder, it was he. She slipped the vial into a velvet pouch, tucked it into her handbag, and donned her straw hat, its brim wide enough to shade her face from curious eyes. The village was stirring as she stepped onto the cobbled lane, the air rich with the scent of blooming lavender and freshly baked bread from the bakery. St. Mary Mead had a deceptive charm, its idyllic surface hiding currents of ambition, resentment, and secrets. Jane, as Miss Primrose, blended effortlessly into this tapestry, her unassuming demeanour a perfect cloak for her sharp observations. The chemist's shop stood at the corner of High Street, its green-painted facade adorned with a brass sign that read Hargreaves and Son, Apothecary. A bell jingled as Jane pushed open the door, stepping into a world of polished wood counters and glass bottles glinting under gaslight. The air smelled of camphor and dried herbs, a sharp contrast to the village's floral sweetness. Mr. Hargreaves, a wiry man with a bald pate and wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his ledger, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to polite welcome. "Good morning, Miss Primrose," he said, setting down his pen. "What brings you here? A remedy? For the roses, perhaps?" His tone carried a gentle humour, recalling their last chat about gardening, a pretext Jane had used to gauge his trustworthiness. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with practiced warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Hargreaves. You've caught me out. I'm afraid. My roses are thriving, but I have a curious question about a powder I found in my garden shed. Likely some old fertilizer, but I'd rather be sure it's safe before I use it." His brow lifted slightly, intrigued. "A powder, you say? Well, Let's have a look. I've seen all manner of concoctions in my time. He gestured to a small workbench at the back, where a microscope and neatly labelled vials awaited. Jane produced the pouch, her movements deliberate, and handed him the vial. It's a queer shade, almost greenish. I thought it best to consult an expert. Mr. Hargreaves held the vial to the light, squinting as he turned it slowly. Unusual, indeed. Let's test it properly. He sprinkled a pinch onto a glass slide, adding a drop of clear liquid from a dropper. Under the microscope, he studied it with the intensity of a scholar deciphering an ancient text. Jane watched, her heart steady but her mind alert, noting the faint tremor in his fingers as he adjusted the lens. After a long moment, he straightened, his face grave. This is no fertilizer, Miss Primrose. It's a chemical compound, a derivative of a slow-acting, but quite toxic. A small dose could cause dizziness, nausea, and in larger amounts, much worse. His voice dropped, as if the walls might overhear. Where did you say you found this? Jane tilted her head, her expression one of innocent concern. In the shed, tucked behind some old pots. I suppose it could have been left by the previous tenant. Is it common in these parts? He shook his head, his lips pursed. Not at all. Aconitine isn't something you'd stumble across by chance. It's derived from monkshood, a plant not grown locally. Someone would have had to procure it deliberately. He hesitated, then added, I keep strict records of such substances. Let me check my ledger. Jane nodded, her pulse quickening as he flipped through a leather-bound book, muttering to himself. She Helvetica, Nui. This is a chemical compound, a derivative of aconitine, slow-acting, but quite toxic. She knew the name amongst hood. The Devil's Helmet, a plant as beautiful as it was deadly. Edmund's recent purchase of chemicals leapt to her mind. Could he have sourced this poison? And if so, how had it ended up in Clara's teacup? Mr. Hargreaves paused at a page, his finger tracing a line. Here's something. About 3 weeks ago, a gentleman purchased a small quantity of aconitine-based powder. Said it was for a scientific study, though he was vague on the details. I required a signature, of course. He turned the ledger toward Jane, pointing to a name scrawled in bold ink. Edmund Thornton. Jane's breath caught, but she kept her face serene, a mask of mild curiosity. Edmund Thornton, the squire's cousin. How odd. I suppose he's quite the scholar. Hargreaves snorted softly. Scholar, hardly. He was nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, paid in cash and left. Quickly, I thought it strange, but the paperwork was in order. She leaned forward, feigning surprise. Goodness, that is peculiar. Did he mention what the study was for? No, and I didn't press. My business is remedies, not motives. Hargreaves closed the ledger with a snap. But I'd be cautious. Miss Primrose, this isn't a substance to trifle with. Thank you, Mr. Hargreaves, Jane said, her voice warm but her mind racing. You've been most helpful. I'll dispose of it safely, don't you worry. She slipped the vial back into her pouch, her fingers brushing the cool glass as she calculated her next move. Outside, the village hummed with its usual rhythm, children chasing a hoop down the lane. A farmer's cart rattling past, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Jane walked slowly, her straw hat casting a shadow over her thoughtful eyes. Edmund's purchase of aconitine was no coincidence. The powder in Clara's teacup, the ledger's suspicious payments. his midnight retrieval of a hidden package, all wove a net around him. But was he acting alone? And why frame Clara? The squire's wealth was motive enough, but Jane sensed deeper currents, perhaps tied to the missing heirloom or the stranger scene near the manor. She needed to test Edmund, to gauge his reaction, without tipping her hand. The village meeting that evening, a dull affair about drainage repairs, offered the perfect stage. As Miss Primrose, she could slip a pointed question into casual chatter, watch his eyes, his hands, for the telltale signs of guilt. Jane smiled faintly, adjusting her hat. The game was afoot, and she was in her element. The village hall was a squat stone building, its interior warmed by a crackling fire and the murmur of gathered locals. Benches creaked under the weight of farmers, shopkeepers, and matrons. Their faces flushed from the day's work or the cider passed around discreetly. Jane, as Miss Primrose, took a seat near the back, her knitting bag at her side a prop as much as a pastime. Edmund stood near the front, his tailored coat a touch too fine for the occasion, his smile polished but strained. He was speaking. With the vicar, his gestures animated, but Jane noted the way his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting an interruption. The meeting began with tedious reports on ditch maintenance, but Jane's attention was on Edmund. She waited until a lull in the discussion, when the room buzzed with side conversations, to make her move. Rising with the air of a curious spinster, she approached Edmund, her knitting needles clicking softly in her bag. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice bright but edged with intent. "I was just at Mr. Hargreaves' shop, and he mentioned you'd purchased some rather unusual chemicals recently. Aconitine, was it? For a study," he said. "I do hope it's nothing dangerous." The effect was immediate. Edmund's smile froze, his hand tightening on his glass. Aconitine. His laugh was too loud, drawing a few glances. "Oh, just a bit of research, Miss Primrose. Nothing to fret about. Old compounds, you know, for botanical studies." His eyes flicked to hers, searching, and Jane met them with a bland, encouraging nod. "Botanical studies. How fascinating," she said, tilting her head. "Though I hear aconitine is frightfully toxic. You must be awfully careful with it." His jaw twitched, a muscle betraying his composure. Of course, all above board, I assure you." He excused himself abruptly, claiming a need to speak with the treasurer, and Jane watched him go, noting the stiffness in his stride. He was rattled, and she was pleased. Her disguise as Miss Primrose had held firm. No one suspected the quiet schoolteacher of laying traps. But Edmund's evasiveness confirmed her suspicions. He was neck-deep in this plot, and the was his weapon. As the meeting droned on, Jane's thoughts turned to the broader puzzle. The heirloom's theft, the forged documents in the manor's secret passage, the coded note glimpsed at the bazaar Lydia, the mysterious governess was likely Edmund's accomplice. Their motive was clear: discredit Clara, perhaps eliminate Thornton, and claim the estate. But the final step mentioned in the note suggested a bolder move, one Jane had to intercept before it struck. She left the hall as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead. The sky streaked with pink and gold. The village seemed peaceful, but Jane knew better. The killer or killers were watching, their plans fraying under her quiet scrutiny. She returned to her cottage, locking the door and setting the vial on her dresser once more. The powder gleamed faintly, a silent accusation. Jane sat by the fire, her knitting untouched, her mind weaving connections. She was closing in, her disguise a perfect shield, But the killer's next move would test her yet. The night deepened, and Jane's eyes lingered on the vial. She had cornered a key player, but the game was far from won. Tomorrow she would press harder, perhaps at the church bazaar, where Lydia might reveal more. For now she was content, Miss. Primrose remained unnoticed, a ghost in the village's midst, while Jane Marple drew ever closer to the truth. Chapter 8. The stolen glance. The church bazaar in St. Mary Mead was a kaleidoscope of colour and sound, a vibrant tapestry woven from the threads of village life. The late summer sun cast a golden haze over the green, where stalls brimmed with homemade jams, knitted scarves, and trays of scones still warm from the oven. Laughter mingled with the clink of teacups and the occasional bark of a dog chasing a child through the crowd. To the untrained eye, it was a scene of pure, unadulterated joy, community basking in its own simplicity. But to Miss Jane Marple, disguised as the unassuming Miss Primrose, it was a chessboard, each villager a piece, moving in patterns only she could discern. Jane stood near a stall selling lavender sachets, her grey hair tucked neatly under a modest straw hat, her spectacles perched low on her nose. Her dress, a faded floral affair, was deliberately chosen to blend into the crowd, its muted tones mirroring the understated elegance of a retired schoolteacher. She held a small basket, ostensibly to collect her purchases, but it served another purpose, a prop to keep her hands busy while her eyes roamed. She was hunting, not for bargains, but for the flicker of guilt, the subtle gesture that betrayed a secret. Her target today was Edmund Thornton, the squire's charming but enigmatic cousin, whose easy smile and polished manners had already won over half the village. Jane had observed him closely since the dinner at Thornton Manor, where a shadowy figure likely him had slipped away during the power outage. His anxious glances in the moonlight 2 nights ago, when she'd spotted him retrieving a hidden package, only sharpened her suspicions. Now, at the bazaar, she'd noticed something new. A woman, a stranger to St. Mary Mead, lingering near Edmund with a familiarity that set Jane's instincts alight. The woman, introduced to the villagers as Lydia Harper, was a striking figure. Her auburn hair was swept into a loose chignon, and her emerald dress hugged her frame with a tailored grace that spoke of city sophistication rather than rural modesty. She had arrived a week ago, claiming to be a distant relative of the vicar's wife, but her story was as flimsy as tissue paper to Jane's discerning mind. Lydia's eyes, sharp and restless, darted through the crowd as if searching for something more. Someone. When they settled on Edmund, a silent understanding seemed to pass between them, a thread Jane was determined to tug. Jane adjusted her hat, feigning interest in a jar of gooseberry jam as she positioned herself closer to the pair. They stood near the tambola stall, where Mrs. Bantry, the vicar's wife, was cheerfully coaxing coins from passers-by. Edmund leaned in to whisper something to Lydia, his hand brushing hers as he passed a folded slip of paper. It was a fleeting gesture, one most would overlook, but to Jane it was as loud as a shout. A coded note, she thought, her pulse quickening. The game was afoot. She needed to get closer, to glimpse the note's contents without arousing suspicion, slipping into the role of Miss Primrose with practiced ease. Jane approached the tambola stall, her basket swinging lightly at her side. "Oh, Mrs. Bantry, what a splendid turnout," she said, her voice carrying the warm, slightly tremulous cadence of an elderly spinster. "I simply must try my luck at the tambola. Have you any tickets left?" Mrs. Bantry, her cheeks flushed from the day's excitement, beamed. "Miss Primrose, you're in luck." 3 tickets for a shilling, and there's a lovely set of teacups still up for grabs. Jane handed over a coin, her movements deliberate and slow, allowing her to linger near Edmund and Lydia. As Mrs. Bantry rummaged for tickets, Jane tilted her head just enough to catch a glimpse of the note in Lydia's hand. It was small, no, larger than a playing card, with tight, precise handwriting. She couldn't read the words from this distance, but she saw the phrase "final step" scrawled in bold ink before Lydia tucked it into her reticule. Jane's mind raced. Final step. The words carried a weight, a promise of action, perhaps of violence. She needed to know more. Miss Primrose, here you are. Mrs. Bantry handed over 3 numbered tickets, her chatter pulling Jane's attention. Back to the moment. You must come to tea next week. I've a new blend from London you'll adore. Oh, I'd be delighted, Jane replied, her smile as soft as butter, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She stepped away from the stall, her eyes tracking Lydia, who had drifted toward a display of embroidered linens. Edmund, meanwhile, had vanished into the crowd, his departure as smooth as a cat's. Jane's instincts told her to follow. Lydia, if the note was part of a larger scheme, and she was certain it was Lydia was the key to unlocking it. The bazaar was a maze of distractions, but Jane moved with purpose, her steps light and unhurried to avoid drawing attention. She paused at a stall selling knitted mittens, pretending to examine a pair while keeping Lydia in her peripheral vision. The younger woman was now speaking to Mrs. Cleary, the village seamstress, her gestures animated but her expression guarded. Jane needed an opening, a way to engage Lydia without betraying her own curiosity. An idea sparked. She approached the linen stall, her basket now holding a small jar of jam for authenticity. "Goodness, what lovely work," she said, addressing Mrs. Cleary, but ensuring her voice carried to Lydia. "These napkins would be perfect for a tea party, don't you think?" Mrs. Cleary, a stout woman with a penchant for gossip, nodded eagerly. "Oh, absolutely, Miss Primrose. They're my best yet. Miss Harper here was just admiring them." Lydia turned, her smile polite but measured. "They're quite charming," she said, her voice smooth as polished glass. "I was thinking of buying a set for my sister in London." Jane seized the opportunity. "London, you say? Oh, how I miss the city's bustle, though I'm quite content here in St. Mary Mead." She adjusted her spectacles, peering at Lydia with the mild curiosity of a harmless old woman. "You must find our little village rather quiet after such a place. Are you visiting long, Miss Harper?" Lydia's eyes flickered, a momentary crack in her composure. "Only a short stay," she replied, her fingers tightening around her reticule. "I'm here to visit family, but I'll be back in London soon enough." "Family, how lovely," Jane said, her tone warm but her mind dissecting every word. The vicar's wife had mentioned Lydia's claim of being a distant cousin, but Jane had already checked the parish records. No such connection existed. "I do hope you're enjoying our bazaar. It's the heart of the village, you know. Everyone comes together, sharing stories, secrets." She let the word linger, watching Lydia's reaction. A faint flush crept up Lydia's neck, but her smile held firm. "It's delightful," she said. "So many kind people." "Indeed," Jane agreed, her gaze drifting to the reticule. "Though one must be careful with one's belongings in such a crowd. I once lost a dear brooch at a fair like this, slipped right out of my bag." Lydia's hand instinctively moved to her reticule, clutching it closer. "Oh, I'm quite careful," she said, her voice a touch too sharp. I keep my things close. Jane nodded, her expression serene, but her mind alight with triumph. The note was important, and Lydia knew it. She was protecting it, which meant it held a secret worth guarding. Jane needed to see it, but she couldn't risk a confrontation, not yet. Instead, she shifted tactics. Have you tried the lemonade, Miss Harper? Mrs. Bantry swears it's the best in the county. Lydia relaxed slightly, grateful for the change in topic. Not yet, but I'll make a point of it. Thank you, Miss Primrose. Jane excused herself, drifting toward the lemonade stall, but keeping Lydia in her sights. The younger woman lingered at the linens, her posture tense, as if expecting pursuit. Jane's mind churned. The note, the final step, Edmund's secretive exchange, it all pointed to a conspiracy. One likely tied to the missing heirloom from Thornton Manor and the squire's erratic behaviour. But Lydia was a new piece in the puzzle, and Jane needed to know her role. As she sipped a glass of tart lemonade, Jane recalled the gossip she'd overheard in the tea house. Lydia had been asking questions about Thornton Manor, its history, its occupants. She'd claimed to be researching local architecture, but Jane suspected a deeper motive. Could Lydia be connected to the squire's past? A former governess, perhaps, or someone with a grudge. The manor held secrets, Jane was certain, and Lydia's arrival was no coincidence. The bazaar was reaching its peak, the crowd swelling as the afternoon wore on. Jane spotted Edmund reappearing near the cake stall, his charm in full force as he flirted with the baker's daughter. But his eyes kept darting to Lydia, a silent signal passing between them. Jane needed to act quickly. If the note was part of their plan, she had to see it before it disappeared. She devised a plan, simple but effective. The bazaar's raffle was about to begin, and the crowd would gather near the vicar's podium, creating a momentary chaos. Jane could use the distraction to get closer to Lydia, perhaps even glimpse the note's contents. She moved toward the podium, her basket swinging lightly, her expression one of innocent anticipation, as the vicar called for attention. The villagers surged forward, clutching their raffle tickets. Jane positioned herself just behind Lydia, close enough to smell the faint jasmine of her perfume. The younger woman was distracted, her attention on the vicar's booming voice. Jane's fingers itched to reach for the reticule, but she knew such a move was too risky. Instead, she waited, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. The opportunity came when a child, chasing a runaway balloon, bumped into Lydia, causing her to stumble. The reticule slipped from her grasp, landing on the grass. Jane, quick as a flash, bent to retrieve it, her movements disguised as a helpful gesture. "Oh, my dear, let me get that for you," she said, her voice all kindness as she scooped up the bag as she handed it back. Jane's fingers brushed the folded note, which had slipped halfway out. She caught a glimpse of more text. Midnight. Gate. Clara. Her heart skipped. Clara, the squire's niece, was at the heart of this, just as Jane had suspected. The note was a plan, a directive, and it confirmed Lydia's role in the conspiracy. Lydia snatched the reticule back, her eyes flashing with alarm. "Thank you," she said, her voice tight. "I must be more careful." "Not at all," Jane replied, her smile unwavering. "These things happen in a crowd." She stepped back, blending into the throng as the raffle winners were announced. Her mind was racing, piecing together the fragments. Midnight, the gate, Claret suggested. A meeting, perhaps a trap, and Edmund, handing over the note, was orchestrating it with Lydia. Jane spent the rest of the bazaar observing from a distance, her disguise as Miss Primrose still intact. Lydia and Edmund avoided each other now, their earlier familiarity replaced by careful distance, but Jane wasn't fooled. They were partners in something sinister, and the note was the key. She needed to uncover their connection to Thornton Manor, to the heirloom, to Clara. Was Lydia a scorned lover, a hired accomplice, or something else entirely? As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the green, Jane made her way back to her cottage. The bazaar had been a success not for the trinkets she'd purchased, but for the glimpse into the conspirators' plans. She sat at her small writing desk, the lamplight casting a warm glow over her notebook. In her neat, precise handwriting, she recorded the day's observations, the note, the final step, the mention of Clara, Lydia's guarded demeanour. She leaned back, her fingers steepled, her mind sifting through the clues. Lydia was no mere visitor. Her ties to Thornton Manor ran deeper than she'd admitted. A former governess, perhaps, with knowledge of the manor's secrets, or someone with a personal stake in the squire's downfall. Jane's thoughts drifted to the ledger she'd found in the locked study, its cryptic payments hinting at blackmail or bribery. Could Lydia be the recipient, or was she the one pulling the strings? One thing was certain, the final step was approaching, and Clara was in danger. Jane's disguise had kept her invisible, a shadow among the villagers, but the killers were watching. She could feel their eyes, their suspicion. Even if they didn't yet know Miss Primrose was anything more than she seemed. Jane closed her notebook, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. The bazaar had given her what she needed, a thread to pull, a glimpse into the heart of the conspiracy. She would follow it carefully, patiently, until the truth unraveled. For now, her cover was secure, her disguise fooling all but the wary. Killer, and that, she thought with a faint smile, was exactly as it should be. Chapter 9. The Manor's Secret Passage. The late summer sun dipped low over St. Mary Mead, casting long shadows across the cobblestone paths that wound through the village. Thornton Manor loomed at the edge of the town, its ivy-clad walls glowing. Golden in the fading light, a silent sentinel guarding secrets Jane Marple was determined to unravel. Disguised as Miss Primrose, the retired schoolteacher with a penchant for knitting and polite conversation, Jane moved through the village with the ease of a shadow, her sharp mind cataloguing every glance, every whispered word. Today, her destination was the manor itself, under the pretext of a charity tour organized to raise funds for the village church. It was the perfect opportunity to probe deeper into the web of deceit she'd been untangling. The air buzzed with excitement as villagers gathered on the manor's sprawling lawn. Children darted between tables laden with homemade jams and embroidered linens, their laughter mingling with the hum of polite chatter. Jane, in a lavender dress and a modest straw hat, clutched a small notebook, pretending to jot down details about the tour. Her eyes, however, were everywhere on the squire's tense posture as he greeted guests, on Clara's forced smile as she handed out pamphlets on Edmund's absence, which prickled her instincts like a burr under a saddle. Miss Primrose, how delightful you could join us. Mrs. Harrow, the vicar's wife, bustled over, her cheeks flushed from organizing the event. The manor's gardens are simply divine this time of year, and the squire's been so generous to open the east wing for tours. Jane smiled, her expression soft but her mind razor-sharp. I wouldn't miss it, Mrs. Harrow. I've always admired old houses. There's so much history in their walls, don't you think? Her tone was light, but the question carried a subtle weight, as if she were inviting the walls themselves to whisper their secrets. Mrs. Harrow nodded enthusiastically. "Quite right. Why, Thornton Manor's been standing since the Tudors. They say there are hidden nooks and crannies no one's seen in centuries." Jane's pulse quickened, though her face betrayed nothing. Hidden nooks. The phrase lodged in her mind like a key turning in a lock. "How intriguing," she murmured, tucking the thought away as she joined the small group assembling for the tour. The guide, a wiry man named Mr. Pym. The manor's groundskeeper led them through the grand oak doors into the east wing. The air inside was cool and heavy with the scent of polished wood and old books. Jane trailed at the back, her sensible shoes silent on the parquet floor, her eyes scanning every detail, the portraits with their stern gazes, the tapestries fraying. At the edges, the odd scuff mark on a baseboard that seemed out of place. Her knack for noticing irregularities, honed over years of quiet observation, was her greatest weapon. Mr. Pym droned on about the manor's history, but Jane's attention snagged on a narrow corridor branching off from the main hall. It was roped off, a velvet cord barring entry, and a faded tapestry hung unevenly against the wall. The tapestry's lower corner curled slightly, revealing a sliver of wood panelling that didn't quite match the rest. Jane's heart gave a little leap. A discrepancy. She filed it away, her fingers itching to investigate. But she kept her expression one of polite interest as the tour continued. The group paused in the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes. Squire Thornton stood by the fireplace, answering questions with a strained smile. Jane noted the way his hands fidgeted, the way his eyes darted to the door whenever someone mentioned the missing heirloom, a sapphire brooch, rumoured to be worth a small fortune. Clara, hovering nearby, looked pale, her fingers twisting the edge of her scarf. Jane's earlier conversations with Clara had revealed the young woman's suspicion that someone was framing her for the theft, and Jane was inclined to agree. The question was who and why. As the tour moved to the drawing room, Jane seized her chance. Feigning a stumble, she clutched at Mrs. Harrow's arm. "Oh dear me, I've dropped my handkerchief," she said, her voice quivering with just the right touch of distress. "I'll just pop back to the library to fetch it. Do go on without me." Double quotes. Mrs. Harrow, flustered, waved her off. "Of course, Miss Primrose, take your time." Jane slipped back down the corridor, her steps brisk but silent. The roped-off passage beckoned. She glanced over her shoulder. No one was watching. With a deft movement, she unhooked the velvet cord and stepped into the shadowed corridor. The air here was mustier, the light dimmer, as if the manor itself were holding its breath. She approached the tapestry, her fingers brushing the rough fabric. It was heavier than it looked, and when she lifted it, the wood panelling beneath gleamed, faintly, polished by years of secret touches. Jane pressed her palm against the panel, testing for give. A soft click rewarded her, and the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Her breath caught a secret passage. She'd heard tales of such things in old houses, but to find one was another matter entirely. She hesitated, her practical side warning of danger, but her curiosity, her need to know one out. She pulled a small flashlight from her handbag, a tool she never left home without, and stepped into the passage. The stairs were steep and uneven, the air growing colder with each step. Her light danced across rough stone walls, revealing cobwebs and the faint scratches of long-ago footsteps. At the bottom, the passage widened into a low-ceilinged chamber. its walls lined with dusty crates and a single wooden table. On the table lay a bundle of papers tied with twine and a small metal box. Jane's pulse raced. This was no ordinary hiding spot, this was a lair. She approached the table, her flashlight illuminating the papers. They were forgeries, she realized, with adult deeds and letters, meticulously crafted to implicate Clara in the heirloom theft. The handwriting mimicked Clara's, but the ink was too fresh, the phrasing too stilted. Jane's lips pressed into a thin line. Someone had gone to great lengths to frame the squire's niece, but who? Edmund, with his secretive glances and late-night prowling. Lydia, the mysterious governess with her coded notes, or someone else entirely. The metal box drew her eye next. It was locked, but the mechanism was old and rusted. Jane, ever resourceful, produced a hairpin from her hat and set to work. The lock yielded with a satisfying click, revealing a stack of letters and a small ledger. The letters were addressed to Squire Thornton, but their tone was menacing, demanding payments in exchange for silence about past indiscretions. The ledger detailed transactions, large sums paid to an unnamed recipient. Jane's mind whirred. Blackmail, the heirlooms theft, the forged documents, the poisonal pieces of a larger scheme. But whose? A faint scuff echoed from the passage. Above, Jane froze, her flashlight snapping off. The darkness swallowed her, her breath shallow as she listened. Another scuff, closer now. Someone was coming. She slipped the ledger into her handbag, her movements swift and silent, and tucked herself behind a crate, her small frame blending into the shadows. Her heart pounded, but her mind remained clear. She was Miss Primrose, unassuming and unnoticed, but she was also Jane Marple, and she would not be caught. The footsteps stopped at the chamber's entrance. A figure stepped into view, their silhouette framed by the faint light from the passage. It was Edmund, his face pale and taut, a flashlight of his own casting jittery beams across the room. He moved to the table, his hands trembling as he rifled through the papers. "Where is it?" he muttered, his voice low and frantic. She couldn't have. Jane held her breath, her mind racing. Edmund was searching for the ledger, which meant he knew its importance. But did he know she was here? She watched as he opened the metal box, his expression darkening when he found it empty. He cursed under his breath, his movements growing erratic. Jane's eyes narrowed. His panic was revealing guilt, perhaps, or fear of being exposed. Edmund lingered a moment longer, then turned and hurried back up the stairs, his flashlight beam bobbing wildly. Jane waited until the sound of his footsteps faded before emerging. From her hiding place, she moved quickly, memorizing the chambers, lay out the crates, the table, the exact position of the forged documents. She would need every detail for what came next. The passage's entrance loomed above, and she climbed the stairs with care, her flashlight guiding her back to the tapestry. She emerged into the corridor, her heart still racing but her mind alight with triumph. The ledger was hers, a key piece of the puzzle, and Edmund's reaction had confirmed its significance. She replaced the tapestry, ensuring it hung exactly as before, and rehooked the velvet cord. The tour group's voices echoed faintly from the drawing room she hadn't been missed. Slipping back into the library, Jane retrieved a handkerchief from her bag, dropping it to the floor as if she'd just found it. She rejoined the group, her face a mask of serene apology. "So sorry for the delay," she said to Mrs. Harrow, who barely glanced her way. "I'm terribly clumsy sometimes." The tour continued, But Jane's thoughts were elsewhere, piecing together the implications of her discovery. The forged documents were meant to frame Clara, but the ledger suggested a deeper motive: blackmail, perhaps tied to the squire's past. Edmund's involvement was clear, but Lydia's role remained murky. And who was the stranger seen near the manor? Jane's mind spun with possibilities, each thread weaving into a tapestry of deception. As the tour ended and the group spilled back onto the lawn, Jane lingered near the manor's entrance, her eyes catching a flicker of movement in an upstairs window. A curtain twitched, and for a moment she thought she saw Lydia's pale face staring down. The woman's eyes were sharp, searching, as if she sensed something amiss. Jane turned away, her expression unchanged, but a chill ran through her. The killer or killers were watching, and they were closer than she'd thought. Back in her cottage that evening, Jane sat by the fire, the ledger open on her lap. She traced the cryptic entries, her mind mapping out the next steps. The forged documents, the poison, the coded note. She was close, so close, to unraveling it all. But the killer was wary, and Jane knew she'd need to tread carefully. Her disguise as Miss Primrose had held, fooling everyone except, perhaps, the one who mattered most. She closed the ledger, her lips curving into a faint smile. The game was far from over, but tonight she'd won a small victory. The secret passage had given up its secrets, and Jane Marple, hidden behind her unassuming facade, was one step closer to the truth. Chapter 10. The Confrontation. The village hall of St. Mary Mead buzzed with a restless energy as dusk settled over the rooftops, casting long shadows through the arched windows. The annual harvest dance was in full swing, its lively fiddles and laughter a stark contrast to the undercurrent of suspicion Jane Marple sensed beneath the gaiety. Disguised as Miss Primrose, the retired schoolteacher with her neatly pinned grey bun and modest lavender shawl, Jane moved through the crowd with the ease of a shadow, her sharp eyes darting from face to face. Tonight was no ordinary evening. It was the stage she had chosen to unsettle her quarry Edmund Thornton and the enigmatic Lydia, whose coded note had revealed their dangerous intent. Jane adjusted her spectacles, a prop she wore not for vision, but for effect, and sipped a glass of elderflower cordial, her lips pursed as if savouring the sweetness. In truth, her mind was a whirl of calculations, piecing together the fragments of her investigation, the missing heirloom, the ledger of suspicious payments, the slow-acting toxin, and now the cryptic phrase, "final step," glimpsed in Lydia's note. She had no hard proof yet to bring to Constable Harrow, but Jane knew the power of a well-placed nudge. Tonight she would rattle the conspirators, provoke a reaction, and watch their carefully laid plans fray at the edges. The hall was a kaleidoscope of colour villages in their Sunday best, twirling to the rhythm of a jaunty reel. Banners of autumn leaves hung from the rafters, and the scent of apple tarts mingled with the faint musk of polished wood. Jane positioned herself near the refreshment table, where she could observe the room without drawing attention. Edmund stood across the hall, his polished charm on full display as he chatted with Mrs. Havisham, the vicar's wife. His dark hair gleamed under the chandelier's glow, but Jane noted the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tightened around his glass when Clara, his cousin, passed by with a cool glance. Lydia, meanwhile, lingered near the musicians, her auburn hair catching the light like a flame. She wore a deep green dress that seemed too fine for a governess, her posture poised yet alert, like a cat watching a sparrow. Jane had learned enough about Lydia to know she was no mere bystander. past connection to Thornton Manor and her coded exchange with Edmund marked her as a key player in this murky affair. The question was how to draw them out without revealing her hand. Jane set down her glass and drifted toward the dance floor, her steps deliberate. She paused near Clara, who stood alone by a pillar, her pale blue dress making her look younger. "Almost fragile, my dear," Jane said, her voice soft as Miss Primrose's. "You look as if you've lost your partner for this reel. May I keep you company?" Clara's eyes, shadowed with worry, softened at the sight of the kindly sporty chair. "Oh, Miss Primrose, you're too kind. I'm just not much in the mood for dancing tonight." Jane tilted her head, her expression one of gentle concern. "I understand, my dear. These gatherings can be overwhelming, especially with family tensions." She let the words hang, watching Clara's reaction. Clara's lips parted, then closed, as if weighing whether to confide. "It's Uncle," she said at last, her voice low. "He's been so strange lately, and Edmund, I don't trust him. He's always whispering with that woman, Lydia. I saw them in the garden last night, passing something between them." Jane's pulse quickened, but she kept her face serene. "How curious," she murmured. "Perhaps it was nothing, just a private matter. But one does wonder." She trailed off, planting a seed of doubt, knowing Clara's words would soon ripple through the village's gossip mill. It was a calculated move. Mand and Lydia would hear of it, and suspicion would tighten their nerves. As the reel ended, Jane excused herself and moved toward the musicians, where Lydia stood, now alone, her fingers tapping restlessly against her clutch. Jane adopted a slightly flustered air, the perfect guise for Miss Primrose. "Oh, Miss Lydia, I must compliment your dress," she said, her tone warm. "It's so rare to see such elegance in our little village. You must have travelled far to find such a style." Lydia's smile was tight, her eyes wary. "Thank you, Miss Primrose. It's an old gown, nothing special." Her voice carried a faint edge, as if she sensed a trap beneath the compliment. Jane pressed on, her tone airy but pointed. "I do envy those with secrets to their style. Why, I heard someone mention a note passed in the garden. Such intrigue. It reminds me of the novels I used to read to my pupils. Cloaks and daggers, hidden messages." She chuckled, watching Lydia's face, the younger woman's hand stilled on her clutch, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Gossip travels fast here," she said lightly, but her eyes flicked toward Edmund across the room. "People see shadows and invent stories." "Quite so," Jane agreed, her smile unwavering. "But shadows can hide such interesting truths, don't you think?" She excused herself before Lydia could respond, feeling the first thread of her plan tighten. Lydia's unease was palpable, a crack in her polished facade. Jane's next move was riskier. She needed to confront Edmund directly, but subtly, to keep her disguise intact. She found him near the punch bowl, laughing with a group of local farmers. His charm was a well-honed weapon, but Jane saw the calculation in his eyes, the way he scanned the room as if tracking threats. She approached, clutching a small handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice quavering just enough to sell her role as the nervous Miss Primrose. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a moment. It's about, well, a delicate matter." Edmund's smile was all teeth, but his eyes narrowed. "Of course, Miss Primrose. How can I assist a lady such as yourself?" Jane leaned closer, lowering her voice. "It's the strangest thing. I overheard talk of a missing heirloom from the manor, and someone mentioned payments. I thought, as a gentleman of standing, you might know if there's truth to it. I'd hate for rumours to tarnish your family's name." The effect was immediate. Edmund's smile froze, and his hand tightened around his glass, the knuckles whitening. "Rumours are dangerous things, Miss Primrose," he said, his voice smooth, but laced with steel. "I'd advise you not to repeat them. The Manor's affairs are private." "Oh, of course," Jane exclaimed, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. "I only thought to warn you, in case someone less discreet were to spread such tales. Why? I even heard mention of a note, something about a final step. Silly gossip, I'm sure." Edmund's face darkened, and for a moment Jane thought he might drop his glass. "A note," he repeated, his voice low. "Who's been talking about notes?" Jane waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, just whispers, Mr. Thornton. You know how villagers are. I'm sure it's nothing." She stepped back, curtsying slightly. "Do enjoy the dance." As she turned away, she caught a glimpse of Edmund's expression, a mix of anger and alarm that confirmed her gambit had struck true. He exchanged a glance with Lydia across the room, a silent signal that spoke volumes. Jane's heart thrummed with quiet triumph. She had rattled them both, and their reactions were as good as a confession. But she wasn't done yet. The music shifted to a slower waltz, and the crowd thinned as couples paired off. Jane retreated to a corner, pretending to adjust her shawl while her mind raced. Edmund and Lydia were plotting something dire. The final step likely involved Squire Thornton, perhaps even his death, with Clara as the scapegoat. The forged documents Jane had found in the Manor's secret passage pointed to a scheme to frame Clara for the heirloom theft, but the tocsin suggested a darker endgame. Jane needed to act fast, but her disguise was her shield. Miss Primrose was invisible, a harmless old woman no one suspected except, perhaps, the killer. A sudden commotion at the hall's entrance drew her attention. Constable Harrow, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, stepped inside, his eyes scanning the crowd. Jane's stomach tightened. Had someone tipped him off, or was he here? For the dance, unaware of the drama unfolding, she watched as he spoke to Mrs. Havisham, his expression serious. Jane couldn't hear their words, but the vicar's wife pointed toward the refreshment table, where Clara now stood, her face pale. Jane's instincts flared. Clara was vulnerable, the perfect target for Edmund and Lydia's scheme. She moved, swiftly weaving through the dancers with a grace that belied her supposed age. As she reached Clara, she saw Edmund approaching from the opposite side, his expression unreadable. Jane acted on impulse. "Miss Clara," she called, her voice bright. "I've just remembered a recipe for that lavender tea you liked. Shall we discuss it outside? The air here is so warm." Clara blinked, confused but grateful for the interruption. "Oh yes, Miss Primrose, that sounds lovely." Jane steered her toward the hall's side door, casting a glance at Edmund. His eyes followed them, narrowed with suspicion, but he was trapped by the crowd, unable to follow without drawing attention. Outside, the cool night air was a relief, the stars sharp against the inky sky. Jane led Clara to a bench beneath a willow, far from prying ears. "My dear," Jane said, dropping her voice, "I must be frank. I fear you're in danger. There are whispers, dangerous ones, about you and your uncle. I don't believe them, but others might." Clara's eyes widened, her hands twisting in her lap. "Danger? From whom, Edmund? That woman, Lydia?" Jane nodded, her expression grave. "I've heard things, Clara. Things that suggest someone wants to harm your uncle and pin the blame on you. Stay close to people tonight. Don't be alone with Edmund. Or Lydia." Clara's breath hitched, but she nodded. "I knew something was wrong. Thank you, Miss Primrose. I don't know what I'd do without your kindness." Jane patted her hand, her mind already racing ahead. She had bought Clara some safety, but the night was far from over. She needed to keep Edmund and Lydia off balance to push them into a mistake. As she guided Clara back inside, she caught sight of Lydia slipping out the main entrance, her green dress aflash in the moonlight. Jane's instincts screamed that something was afoot. She excused herself from Clara and followed, keeping to the shadows. Lydia moved quickly, her steps purposeful as she headed toward the churchyard, a secluded spot perfect for a clandestine meeting. Jane's heart pounded, but she stayed silent, her sensible shoes making no sound on the grass. She crouched behind a yew tree, watching as Lydia met Edmund near an old mausoleum. Their voices low but urgent. "We can't wait any longer," Lydia hissed. "That old woman's asking too many questions. She knows about the note." "Edmund's?" The voice was sharp. "Miss Primrose. She's nobody. A busybody schoolteacher." "She's not," Lydia snapped. "She's too clever. We need to move tonight, before she talks to Harrow." Jane's breath caught. Her disguise had held, but only just. They were planning something for tonight, perhaps the final step. She needed to act, but confronting them here was too dangerous. Instead, she memorized their words, their gestures, the way Edmund's hand hovered near his pocket, as if checking for something, a weapon, perhaps, or the toxin. As they parted, Jane slipped back to the hall, her mind a storm of plans. She would plant one more seed, one final push to unravel their scheme. She found Mrs. Havisham near the musicians, her face flushed from dancing. "Mrs. Havisham," Jane said, her voice trembling with feigned worry. "I've heard the most dreadful rumor. Someone said there's evidence papers, even hidden in the manor, about the heirloom theft. I do hope it's not true." Mrs. Havisham's eyes widened, her fan snapping shut. "Evidence? My goodness, Miss Primrose, we must tell the constable." Jane nodded, her expression grave, but her heart singing. The gossip would spread like wildfire, reaching Edmund and Lydia's ears. They would panic, make a mistake, and Jane would be there to catch them. She returned to the dance, her lavender shawl a perfect cloak of anonymity, her mind sharp as a blade. The night stretched on, the music growing wilder, the laughter louder, but Jane felt the tension building. Edmund and Lydia were circling, their eyes darting to her now and then, unaware that Miss Primrose was no mere schoolteacher. Jane sipped her cordial, her smile serene, her triumph quiet but certain. She had rattled the conspirators, and their next move would be their undoing. The dance was hers to lead, and she would not miss a step. Chapter 11. The trap is set. The late summer air hung heavy with the scent of honeysuckle as Miss Jane Marple, cloaked in the unassuming guise of Miss Primrose, stepped lightly along the cobbled path toward her rented cottage in St. Mary Mead. The village was alive with the hum of evening, the distant laughter of children playing in the square and the clink of glasses from the Rose and Crown. But Jane's mind was far from the idyllic scene. Her heart beat with the quiet thrill of a chess player moving a pawn into position, knowing the endgame was near. For days she had woven a delicate web, her disguise as the retired schoolteacher, Miss Primrose, allowing her to slip through the village unnoticed. a ghost among the living. Her sharp eyes had catalogued every glance, every whispered word, and now, with the precision of a seamstress threading a needle, she was ready to pull the threads tight. The plan was simple yet audacious. Plant a rumour, bait the trap, and wait for the guilty to betray themselves. Edmund and Lydia, the scheming duo she had been tracking, were close to unravelling, and Jane intended to give them just enough rope. She reached the cottage, its ivy-clad walls glowing faintly in the twilight. Inside, she lit a single oil lamp, casting a warm flicker over the modest parlour. The room was a study in calculated simplicity, books on botany and poetry stacked neatly on a side table, a half-finished embroidery hoop resting on the armchair. All props to cement Miss Primrose's harmless persona. Jane settled into the chair, her fingers brushing the soft linen of her shawl, and reviewed her strategy. The village grapevine, that marvellous machine of whispers, was already humming with the tale she had seeded earlier that day at the baker's shop. "Oh, Miss Primrose, you're so clever with your little investigations," Mrs. Hattie, the baker's wife, had said, her eyes wide with curiosity as she handed Jane a loaf of rye. "They say you've got a knack for finding lost things. Even that old heirloom from Thornton Manor, perhaps." Jane had smiled demurely, adjusting her spectacles. "Oh, my dear Mrs. Hattie, I'm just an old woman with too much time on her hands. But I did hear something curious about that heirloom. Perhaps I've stumbled on a clue or two." She had let the words hang, vague enough to spark interest, sharp enough to pierce the village's collective ear. By noon, the rumour had spread like wildfire. Miss Primrose, the quiet schoolteacher, had evidence pointing to the missing Thornton heirloom, a sapphire brooch that had vanished from the manor months ago. Now, as the clock on the mantel ticked toward 9, Jane knew the bait was set. Edmund and Lydia, whose coded note and clandestine meetings had betrayed their plot to frame Clara for the theft, would not resist the lure of such a threat. The heirloom was the key to their schemer means to discredit Clara and secure Squire Thornton's fortune for themselves. If they believed Miss Primrose held the proof of their guilt, they would act, and Jane would be ready. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and moved to the window. The curtains, thin and floral, offered just enough cover to peer into the darkened garden. The village was quiet now, save for the occasional hoot of an owl. Jane's eyes, accustomed to picking out the smallest irregularities, scanned the shadows. She had left the cottage door unlocked, deliberate invitation, and placed a small, empty jewellery box on the parlour table, its lid ajar as if carelessly forgotten. To anyone sneaking in, it would scream of hidden treasure, a clue to the heirlooms. Whereabouts the minutes stretched, each one taut with anticipation. Jane's mind wandered briefly to her niece Joan, who would have laughed at the notion of her aunt playing the part of a trap-setter in a sleepy village. But Joan didn't know. The steel beneath Janus a Hindley exterior, the mind that turned gossip into evidence and suspicion into truth. She glanced at the clock again, 9:30. The village was asleep, or so it seemed. A faint rustle broke the silence, like the brush of fabric against leaves. Jane's breath caught, but her face remained serene, a mask of calm. She stepped back from the window, retreating to the shadowed corner of the parlour, where a her-backed chair offered concealment. Her heart thumped steadily, not with fear, but with the exhilaration of the hunt. The rustle came again, closer now, followed by the soft creak of the garden gate. The door to the cottage opened with a whisper, so slight it might have been the wind, but Jane knew better. A figure slipped inside, cloaked in darkness, moving with the cautious grace of a cat. The lamplight caught the edge of a skirt, a glint of dark hair. Lydia, Jane's lips curved faintly. She had expected Edmund, the bolder of the two, but Lydia's presence was no surprise. The woman's desperation had been palpable at the church bazaar, her eyes darting like a cornered animal's when Jane had mentioned the coded note. Lydia paused, her gaze sweeping the room. She wore a dark shawl, her face pale in the dim light, and her hands trembled slightly as she approached the table. The jewelry box gleamed invitingly, and Lydia's breath hitched as she reached for it. Her fingers brushed the lid, hesitating, as if sensing a trap. Jane held her breath, willing herself to blend into the shadows. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then a second sounder, heavier tread outside. Lydia froze, her hand still. On the box, the door creaked again, and Edmund stepped into the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. His face was flushed, his eyes wild with a mix of anger and fear. "Lydia, what the devil are you doing?" he hissed, his voice low but sharp. "This is madness. If she's got evidence, we can't just quiet." Lydia snapped, her voice a harsh whisper. "She's not here. Look at this left out like she's taunting us. That old bat knows something, Edmund. We can't let her ruin everything." Jane's heart quickened, but her face remained impassive. She had them now, their words, a confession of intent. The jewelry box was empty, of course, but its presence had done its work, drawing them into her net. She shifted slightly, ensuring her silhouette stayed hidden, and listened as their argument unfolded. Ruin everything. Edmund's voice rose, then dropped as he glanced toward the window. "You're the one who insisted on that blasted note. If you hadn't been so careless. Lydia's eyes flashed. "You're the one who bought the poison, Edmund. If Clara hadn't spilled that tea, Thornton would be dead by now, and we'd be free. But no, you had to play the charming cousin, didn't you?" Jane's mind raced, piecing together the final threads. The poison, the forged documents, the stolen heirloom, all part of a plan to eliminate Squire Thornton and pin the blame on Clara. But Lydia's words confirmed something new. The tea incident, which Jane had suspected was no accident, had been their first attempt at murder. Her quick thinking in pocketing the powder had saved a life, but it had also pushed Edmund and Lydia to desperation. Edmund paced, his boots scuffing the wooden floor. "We need to find that evidence. If this Primrose woman has it, we're done for. The police are already sniffing around the manor." Lydia clutched the jewelry box, her knuckles white. "Then we searched the cottage. Now, if she's got papers, letters, anything." Jane knew it was time. She stepped forward, her movement deliberate, the soft tap of her cane on the floor startling both intruders. "I'm afraid you'll find nothing of the sort," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. In the lamplight, Miss Primrose's spectacles glinted, her grey hair neatly pinned, every inch the harmless schoolteacher, but her eyes, sharp and unyielding, betrayed the mind of Jane Marple. Lydia gasped, dropping the jewelry box with a clatter. Edmund spun, his hand reaching for something in his coat, perhaps, or merely instinct. Jane raised a hand, her expression unruffled. "I wouldn't, Mr. Edmund. The village constable is rather close by tonight, and I've taken the liberty of ensuring he's quite attentive." Edmund's hand froze, his face paling. You're bluffing," he stammered, but his eyes darted to the window, searching the darkness. "Am I?" Jane tilted her head, her smile gentle but cutting. "You see, I've found people often. underestimate an old woman like me. They think I'm just a busybody, poking about with rare books and gardening tips. But I notice things, Mr. Edmund, like the way you and Miss Lydia exchange notes in code, or the way you linger near Thornton Manor at midnight. Curious habits for a cousin and a governess, don't you think? Lydia's face twisted, a mix of fear and defiance. You don't know anything, she spat. You're just a meddling old fool, poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Jane's smile didn't waver. Perhaps, but I do know about the sapphire brooch hidden in a secret passage in the manor, and the forged documents meant to ruin Miss Clara. Oh, and the poison's such a clever choice, slow-acting, almost untraceable. Almost. Edmund's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. You can't prove any of it, he said, but... His voice trembled, betraying his bravado. Jane stepped closer, her cane tapping softly. Can't I? You see, I've had a rather illuminating chat with the chemist in Lower Mead. He was most helpful about certain purchases made recently. And then there's the matter of the ledger in Squire Thornton's study, such interesting entries about payments to a certain governess. She paused, letting the words sink in. But what I find most curious is why you thought you could frame an innocent girl like Clara and walk away unscathed. Lydia's eyes widened, her breath coming in short gasps. You're lying. You couldn't have. Oh, but I have, Jane interrupted, her tone almost cheerful. And I've taken the precaution of sharing my findings with a friend in London, just in case anything should happen to me tonight. A retired inspector, you see. He's terribly thorough. The room fell silent, the weight of Jane's words pressing down like a storm cloud. Edmund and Lydia exchanged a glance, their partnership fraying under the strain. Jane saw at the crack in their alliance, the moment when fear turned allies into enemies. She pressed her advantage, her voice soft but relentless. Miss Lydia, you strike me as a clever woman. Surely you must see that Mr. Edmund's plan is unraveling. He's the one who stands to gain the most, isn't he? The manor, the fortune all his, once Clara is out of the way. But what do you get, my dear? A share of the blame, perhaps? Lydia's face crumpled, her defiance giving way to panic. It wasn't my idea, she blurted, turning to Edmund. You said it would be easy. You said no one would suspect us. Shut up, Lydia. Edmund snapped, his voice raw with desperation. He took a step toward Jane, his eyes blazing, but she stood her ground, her calm unshaken. There's no need for that, she said, her voice steady. The constable really is nearby, and I suspect he'd be most interested in this little scene. Shall we call him in? Edmund hesitated, his gaze flickering between Jane and the door. For a moment, she thought he might bolt, but Lydia's next words sealed their fate. She's right, Edmund, she whispered, her voice breaking. It's over. They'll find the brooch, the documents, everything. We can't run forever. Edmund's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. Jane watched, her heart steady now, the thrill of the chase giving way to quiet satisfaction. She had set the trap, and they had walked into it, their own, greed and fear betraying them. The jewelry box, the rumours, the carefully placed tinsel had worked as she'd planned. Miss Primrose remained untarnished, her disguise a perfect shield. While Jane Marple stood poised to deliver justice, she stepped back, opening the door to reveal the silhouette of Constable Harrow, who had been waiting in the garden as instructed. His lantern cast a stark light across the room, illuminating Edmund's defeated scowl and Lydia's tear-streaked face. "I believe you'll want to hear what these two have to say, Constable," Jane said, her voice mild as ever. "They've been most forthcoming." As Harrow stepped inside, Jane retreated to her chair, picking up her embroidery hoop as if nothing had happened. The constable's questions filled the room, but Jane's mind was already drifting to the next steps ensuring Clara's safety. Returning the heirloom and, perhaps, a quiet cup of tea before the village awoke to the news. Her disguise had held, fooling everyone except perhaps the killer, who had seen too late the steel behind Miss Primrose's gentle smile. The night was far from over, but Jane was content. The trap had sprung, and the truth was hers to unveil. Chapter 12. The killer's move the dawn broke over St. Mary Mead with a deceptive calm. The village bathed in a soft golden light that belied the storm brewing beneath its quaint surface. Miss Jane Marple, still cloaked in her guise as the unassuming Miss Primrose, sat by her cottage window, her knitting needles clicking softly as her mind churned with the precision of a well-oiled machine. The events of the past days had woven an intricate tapestry of clues, and now the threads were pulling taut. Squire Thornton's life hung in the balance, and Jane knew the killer's next move was imminent. Her trap, set so carefully in the village's gossip channels, had stirred the conspirators Edmund and Lydian to a frenzy. But the game was not yet won. The morning air carried the scent of dew-soaked grass and freshly baked bread from the bakery down the lane. Jane's cottage, a modest affair with ivy creeping up its stone walls, was a perfect vantage point. From here she could see the comings and goings of the village, the milkman's cart rattling along, the postmistress bustling with her satchel, and the occasional villager pausing to exchange pleasantries. But Jane's eyes were drawn to Thornton Manor, its grey stone silhouette looming on the hill, a silent sentinel of secrets. She had learned, late the previous night, that Squire Thornton had collapsed at the manor, rushed to the hospital in a state of collapse. Poison, the doctor had whispered to a nurse, unaware that Miss Primrose, lingering near the hospital's reception, had overheard. Jane's fingers paused mid-stitch. The poison, she was certain, matched the slow-acting toxin she had pocketed from Clara's spilled teacup days earlier. The chemist's analysis had been clear. A rare compound, subtle but deadly, designed to mimic natural illness until it was too late. Edmund's purchase of similar chemicals, confirmed by the chemist's records, was no coincidence. Nor was Lydia's coded note, with its chilling reference to a final step. The pieces fit, but Jane needed more than supposition. She needed proof, and she needed to act before the killer struck again. Rising from her chair, Jane smoothed her tweed skirt and adjusted the prim spectacles that completed her disguise. Miss Primrose was a figure of quiet respectability, her grey hair pinned neatly, her demeanour one of gentle curiosity. No one suspected the sharp mind beneath, nor the resolve that drove her. She tucked her knitting into a wicker basket, slipped on her coat, and stepped into the crisp morning. Her destination clear: St. Mary's Hospital, where Squire Thornton lay fighting for his life. The hospital was a small red brick building on the village's edge, its corridors smelling of antiseptic and lavender polish. Jane navigated them with the ease of someone who had memorized every creak of the manor's floorboards and every shadow in the village square. At the reception desk, she offered a warm smile to Nurse Agnes, a plump woman with a penchant for gossip. "Good morning, nurse," Jane said, her voice soft but carrying the faintest tremor of concern. "I heard about poor Squire Thornton. Such a shock. Might I visit him? I've brought some lavender from my garden. Thought it might cheer him." Nurse Agnes's eyes softened. "Oh, Miss Primrose, you're a kind soul. He's in room 3, but he's not conscious, I'm afraid. The doctor's with him now, trying to sort out what's wrong. They're saying, well, it's not my place to say." Jane leaned closer, her expression one of innocent worry. "Oh dear, is it serious? I do hope he'll recover." "It's delicate," Nurse Agnes whispered, glancing around. "They found something in his system. Poison, they think. But you didn't hear that from me." Jane's heart quickened, though her face remained a mask of concern. Poison, how dreadful. Who would do such a thing? Who indeed? Nurse Agnes shook her head. "The police are sniffing around, asking questions. Poor Clara's beside herself, visiting every hour." "Clara's here?" Jane asked, seizing the opening. "Perhaps I could offer her some comfort." "She's in the waiting room," Nurse Agnes said, pointing down the hall. "Mind, she's not in a state for much talk." Jane thanked the nurse and moved toward the waiting room, her steps measured but purposeful. The waiting room was a stark space, with faded green chairs and a single window overlooking a dreary courtyard. Clara sat alone, her auburn hair dishevelled, her hands twisting a handkerchief. Her eyes, red-rimmed, flicked up as Jane entered. "Miss Primrose," Clara said, her voice brittle. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about your uncle," Jane replied, settling beside her. "I thought you might need a friend." Clara's shoulders slumped. "It's awful, they say. He was poisoned, and the way people are looking at me, as if I had anything to do with it." Jane patted her hand, her touch gentle but her mind racing. "Nonsense, my dear. No one who knows you could think such a thing. But tell me, what happened? When did you last see him?" Clara's gaze drifted to the window. "Last night, at the manor. He was in the study, as usual, muttering about debts and papers. I brought him tea, but he barely touched it. Then, after dinner, he just collapsed. Edmund was there, and Lydia she'd come for a visit. They were both so calm, like they expected it." Jane's pulse quickened. Expected it? How strange. "And you say he was in the study? Did he seem unwell earlier?" "He's been off for weeks," Clara said, her voice dropping. "Ever since that heirloom went missing. He kept saying someone was out to ruin him. I thought he was paranoid, but now," her eyes filled with tears. "What if someone really did this?" Jane's mind flashed to the ledger she'd found in the locked study, its cryptic entries hinting at payments to an unknown party. Edmund's anxious glances, Lydia's coded note, it all pointed to a conspiracy to frame Clara while eliminating Thornton. But the poison's administration puzzled her. The teacup from Clara's cottage had held traces of the toxin, but Thornton's collapse suggested a fresh dose. How had it been delivered? Clara Jane said carefully, "Did anyone else handle the tea you brought him?" Clara frowned. "No, I made it myself. But, wait. Lydia offered to carry the tray. She said she wanted to help. I didn't think anything of it." Jane's heart thudded. Lydia, with her polished charm and shadowed past, had the opportunity. But opportunity wasn't proof. Jane needed to confirm the toxin source and connect it to the conspirators. She squeezed Clara's hand. "You've been through so much. Stay strong, my dear. I'll check on your uncle and see what I can learn." Leaving Clara, Jane slipped down the corridor to room 3. The door was ajar, and inside, Dr. Hayward, a wiry man with a perpetually furrowed brow, was reviewing charts. Jane knocked lightly, her expression one of timid concern. "Dr. Hayward, I'm Miss Primrose, a friend of the Thorntons. May I see the squire?" The doctor glanced up, his eyes weary. "He's stable, but not out of danger." "I'm afraid visitors are limited." "Of course," Jane said, her voice trembling just enough. "I only wondered. I heard talk of poison. Is it true?" Dr. Hayward hesitated, then sighed. "It's not public knowledge, but yes. A toxin, slow-acting, was found in his blood. We're administering an antidote, but it's a close thing." Jane's mind raced. "An antidote? So you've identified it?" "We have," he said, lowering his voice. "It's a rare compound, not something you'd find in a common pharmacy. We're lucky to have caught it." Jane nodded, her face a mask of gratitude. "Thank goodness for your expertise, Doctor. Might I ask what it's called? I've a friend in gardening who's curious about such things." Dr. Hayward raised an eyebrow, but relented. "It's called nasty stuff, derived from certain plants. Hard to detect unless you know what to look for." Jane's heart leaped. Veratrine matched the chemist's description of the powder from Clara's teacup. The connection was solidifying, but she needed more. "Thank you, Doctor. I'll pray for the squire's recovery." As she left the room, Jane's mind churned. Veratrine in Thornton's blood, traces in Clara's teacup, and Edmund's purchase of similar chemicals. The conspirators had planned to frame Clara for murder, but Thornton's survival complicated their scheme. Jane needed to act swiftly before Edmund and Lydia realized their plan was unraveling. Back at her cottage, Jane sat at her small desk, a notebook open before her. She sketched a timeline, the heirloom's theft, the ledger's payments, the coded note, the poisoned teacup, and now Thornton's collapse. The pattern was clear, but the delivery of the final dose nagged at her. Lydia's offer to carry the tea tray was suspicious, but Clara had said Thornton barely touched it. Had the poison been administered another way? A knock at the door startled her. Jane slipped the notebook into a drawer and opened the door to find Mrs. Price, the village busybody, her face alight with news. "Miss Primrose," Mrs. Price exclaimed. "Have you heard? The squire's awake. They say he's talking, though. Weakly. The police are there now, asking questions." Jane's pulse quickened. "Awake. That's wonderful news. Did they say anything else?" Mrs. Price leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They're saying he mentioned a tea, but something else. A cordial, maybe, from his study. And Edmund was seen leaving the manor late last night, looking shifty." Jane's mind raced. A cordial from the study. The locked room where Thornton spent hours, where Jane had found the ledger. Had Edmund tampered with something there? She thanked Mrs. Price, promising to visit the hospital later, and closed the door, her thoughts spinning. The study. Jane needed to return, but the manor was now a hive of activity with police and visitors. Her disguise as Miss Primrose had held, but slipping into the study unnoticed would be trickier. Still, she had to try. She donned her coat, tucked a small flashlight into her pocket, and set out for Thornton Manor under the guise of delivering a get-well card. The manor's grounds were quiet, the police presence concentrated at the hospital. Jane slipped through a side gate, her steps light on the gravel path. The study's window, she recalled, was partially hidden by ivy. If she could enter there, she might avoid detection. The window was unlocked, careless oversight, or perhaps intentional. Jane eased it open and climbed inside, her heart pounding. The study was dim, its heavy curtains drawn. The desk, cluttered with papers, held a decanter of amber liquor. Cordial, perhaps. Jane approached, her gloved hands careful not to disturb anything. She uncorked the decanter and sniffed. A faint, bitter undertone beneath the sweetness. Veritrine. She couldn't be sure without testing. But the coincidence was too strong. A noise outside, a footstep on the gravel made her freeze. She ducked. Behind a bookcase, her breath shallow. The study door creaked open, and Edmund's voice, low and tense, filled the room. "She's getting too close," he muttered. "That Primrose woman, she's no fool. Lydia, we need to move faster." Lydia's voice, sharp with panic, replied, "We can't. Thornton's awake. If he talks, he won't," Edmund snapped. The dose was enough to finish him. "But the doctor's antidote, we didn't plan for that. We need to get to him before he says too much." Jane's heart raced. Thornton was awake, and the conspirators were desperate. She waited, motionless, as their footsteps faded. The study was silent again. Jane emerged, her mind made up. She had to get to the hospital, warn the police, and protect Thornton. But first, she pocketed a small vial of the cordial, careful to leave no trace. Back at the hospital, Jane found Clara in the waiting room, her face pale but hopeful. "He's awake," Clara said, her voice trembling. "He asked for me. The police are with him now." Jane nodded, her expression warm but her mind racing. "That's good news, Clara. May I see him? I've brought a card." Clara led her to room 3, where a constable stood guard. Jane's Miss Primrose persona was her shield, her gentle smile disarming. "Just a quick visit," she said, holding up the card. The constable nodded, letting her pass. Inside, Squire Thornton lay propped on pillows, his face ashen but his eyes alert. The doctor was gone, but a police inspector, a stern man named Harris, was taking notes. Jane approached, her voice soft. "Squire Thornton, I'm Miss Primrose. I'm so glad you're recovering." Thornton's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Thank you, miss. It's been a shock." Inspector Harris glanced at her. "Miss Primrose, we're in the middle of course," Jane said, setting the card on the bedside table. "But, Inspector, might I mention something? I heard talk in the village about a cordial in the squire's study. It struck me as odd, given his condition." Harris's eyes sharpened. "A cordial. He mentioned something about that. Said it tasted off last night." Jane's heart leaped. "Perhaps it's worth checking. I couldn't help but overhear at the manor that Edmund was seen there." Late Harris's pen paused. "Edmund, you say? Interesting. We'll look into it." Jane stepped back, her work done. The seed was planted. She left the room, her heart pounding with quiet triumph. Thornton was safe, for now, and the police were closing in. But Edmund and Lydia were desperate, and Jane knew the killer's next move would be bold. As she walked back to her cottage, the village settling into dusk, Jane's mind raced. The cordial, the ledger, the coded note-all pointed to a meticulously planned crime. Her trap had worked, rattling the conspirators, but the game was far from over. Miss Primrose's disguise had fooled everyone except the killer, who was watching, waiting, and plotting their next move. Jane sat by her window. Her knitting resumed, the needles clicking like a metronome. The village was quiet, but the air hummed with tension. She was close, so close to unmasking the truth. But the killer was closer still, and Jane knew the final move was hers to make. Chapter 13. The unmasking the late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Thornton Manor, its honeyed light filtering through the tall windows of the grand drawing-room. The air was thick with anticipation, like the charged hush before a storm. The villagers of St. Mary Mead had gathered at Jane Marple's discreet invitation, their murmurs filling the room with a low, restless hum. They sat on velvet-upholstered chairs arranged in a semicircle, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, suspicion, and unease. Squire Thornton, still pale from his brush with death, sat stiffly in a high-backed armchair, his hands gripping the armrests as though anchoring himself to reality. Clara, his niece, hovered nearby, her eyes darting nervously between her uncle and the assembled crowd. Edmund and Lydia, the conspirators, stood apart, their postures rigid, as if braced for an invisible blow. Jane Marple, still cloaked in the unassuming guise of Miss Primrose, stood near the fireplace, her hands folded primly over her knitting bag. Her grey hair was tucked neatly beneath a modest hat, and her tweed skirt and cardigan gave her the air of a harmless retiree. Yet her pale blue eyes, sharp as cut glass, missed nothing. She had orchestrated this gathering with the precision of a conductor, and now the final movement was about to begin. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Jane began, her voice soft but carrying an undercurrent of authority that silenced the room. "I know recent events have left us all unsettled. Squire Thornton's sudden illness, the whispers of theft, and those troubling anonymous letters have cast a shadow over our little village. But I believe we can bring clarity to this darkness today." The villagers leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. Mrs. Havisham, the tea-house proprietress, clutched her handbag tightly, her lips pursed. The vicar, Mr. Pennington, adjusted his spectacles, his brow furrowed. Even young Tommy, the butcher's apprentice, who had sneaked in hoping for gossip, sat wide-eyed, sensing something momentous. Jane's gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Edmund. His handsome face was taut, his jaw clenched, and his fingers twitched as though longing to fidget. Lydia, standing near the window, maintained a cool facade, but her knuckles were white where they gripped her shawl. Jane's lips curved into a faint, private smile. The stage is set, she thought. As Miss Primrose, she continued, "I've had the privilege of getting to know many of you. You've welcomed me into your homes, your tea-houses, your lives, and in doing so, you've shared fragments of a puzzle that, when pieced together, reveals a most troubling picture." Clara shifted uncomfortably, her eyes meeting Jane's for a fleeting moment. Jane gave her a reassuring nod, then reached into her knitting bag and withdrew a small, folded piece of paper. The room seemed to hold its breath. "This," she said, holding up the paper, "is one of the anonymous letters that have been circulating. It accuses Clara Thornton of plotting against her uncle. Cruel words designed to sow distrust. But words alone are not evidence, so I looked deeper." Edmund's eyes narrowed, and Lydia's head tilted slightly, her expression unreadable. Jane pressed on, her tone measured but deliberate. "I found another document," she said, producing a second sheet, this one creased and yellowed, "hidden in a secret passage within this very manor. A forged ledger, meticulously crafted to implicate Clara in the theft of the Thornton family heirloom sapphire brooch. I believe, valued not just for its worth, but for its sentimental ties to the late Lady Thornton." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Squire Thornton's face darkened, his eyes flicking to Clara, who shook her head vehemently. "I would never," Clara burst out, her voice trembling. "Uncle, you know I'd never touch Mother's brooch." I know, my dear, Thornton said gruffly, his voice hoarse from his recent ordeal, but who would do such a thing? Jane's eyes twinkled with quiet satisfaction. A fair question, Squire. To answer it, we must consider motive. The heirloom's theft was no random act. It was a distraction meant to divert attention from a far graver creamer plot to end your life. The room erupted in gasps. Mrs. Havisham's handbag slipped to the floor with a thud, and Tommy's jaw dropped. Edmund took a step forward, his voice sharp. This is absurd. You're spinning tales, Miss Primrose. Where's your proof? Jane raised a hand, her calm unshaken. Patience, Mr. Edmund. Proof is forthcoming. Let us first consider the poison that nearly claimed the squire's life. A slow-acting toxin identified by our local chemist, Mr. Grayson. I took the liberty of presenting him with a sample found, curiously, in a teacup at Clara's cottage. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. That's impossible. I never. Of course you didn't, Jane said gently. The powder was placed there, just as the forged ledger was placed in the manor's secret passage. Both were designed to point to you, Clara, as the villain. But the true culprits underestimated the curiosity of an old schoolteacher. Lydia's composure cracked, her lips parting as though to speak, but she caught herself, glancing at Edmund. Jane noted the exchange, her mind cataloguing every gesture. Let us turn to another clue, Jane said, reaching into her bag once more. She produced a small, crumpled note, its edges frayed. This was passed between two individuals at the church bazaar. A coded message, brief but telling. It spoke of a final step, a chilling phrase. Wouldn't you agree? She unfolded the note and read aloud, her voice clear and deliberate. The old man's time is near. The final step awaits. The room fell silent, the words hanging like a storm cloud. Squire Thornton's face paled further, his hands trembling. Edmund's voice cut through the tension, sharp and defensive. That could mean anything. You can't prove who wrote it. True, Jane conceded, her tone deceptively mild. But I observed the exchange. I saw the note pass from one hand to another, under the guise of a casual greeting, and I saw the fear in the eyes of one who received it, a fear that betrayed their complicity. Lydia's shawl slipped from her shoulders, her hands clenching into fists. This is nonsense, she said, her voice low but unsteady. You're accusing us without evidence. Who do you think you are? Jane's smile was serene, almost pitying. I am Miss Primrose, a retired schoolteacher with a fondness for puzzles. And this puzzle, I'm afraid, points directly to you, Miss Lydia, and to you, Mr. Edmund. The room exploded in whispers, heads turning toward the accused. Edmund's face flushed with anger, his fists balling at his sides. This is slander. You've no right to accuse us. Then let us test that, Jane said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. She turned to the squire, her expression grave. Squire Thornton, you recently received a payment, a substantial one, from an anonymous source. It was recorded in a hidden ledger in your study, which I had the chance to examine. That payment, I suspect, was meant to secure your silence about certain indiscretions in your past. But when you refused to stay quiet, a more permanent solution was devised. Thornton's eyes widened, his mouth opening, but no words came. Jane pressed on, her voice steady. The poison was administered gradually, in your evening brandy, a clever choice, as it masked the taste. But the antidote, provided in time thanks to Dr. Harrow's expertise, saved your life, and I believe the culprits are in this room." Edmund laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You're delusional, old woman. You think you can pin this on us with scraps of paper and guesses. Where's your evidence?" Jane's eyes locked onto his, unyielding. "Very well, Mr. Edmund. Let us try an experiment." She reached into her bag yet again, producing a small vial filled with a clear liquid. "This is the antidote to the toxin that nearly killed the squire. I obtained it from Mr. Grayson, who was kind enough to explain its properties. It reacts uniquely in the presence of the poison a faint blue tint when mixed." She held up the vial, letting the light catch its contents. "I propose a simple test. We have a sample of the brandy from the squire's decanter, taken before it was disposed of. If I mix a drop of this antidote into the brandy, we shall see if the poison is present. And if it is, well, only those with access to the decanter could be responsible." Edmund's face drained of colour, his bravado faltering. Lydia took a step back, her eyes darting toward the door. The villagers watched, transfixed, as Jane moved to a small table where a glass of brandy sat, preserved from the manor's stock. She uncorked the vial, her movements deliberate, and let a single drop fall into the glass. The liquid shimmered, then turned a faint, unmistakable blue. A collective gasp filled the room. Clara clutched her uncle's arm, her eyes brimming with tears. Mrs. Havisham whispered, "Good heavens," and the vicar crossed himself. Edmund's voice was a snarl. "This proves nothing. Anyone could have tampered with the brandy." "Indeed," Jane said, her tone unruffled, "but only someone with intimate access to the manor would know the squire's habits when he took his brandy, where the decanter was kept, and only someone with a motive would go to such lengths to frame Clara." She turned to Lydia, her gaze piercing. "Miss Lydia, you arrived in St. Mary Mead, claiming to be a governess, but your knowledge of the Thornton family's past suggests a deeper connection. I learned from a discreet inquiry that you once worked for a family closely tied to the Thorntons, a family with a grudge against the squire. A grudge that Edmund, your accomplice, shared." Lydia's facade shattered, her voice rising in a panicked cry. "You can't prove that. You're making it up." "Then why," Jane said softly, "did you attempt to break into my cottage? Last night, searching for evidence you feared I'd found. I wasn't there. Of course, I'd anticipated such a move. But I saw you, Lydia, fumbling in the dark, desperate to protect your secrets." Lydia's knees buckled, and she sank into a chair, her face ashen. Edmund rounded on her, his voice a hiss. "You fool." The room froze, the weight of his words sinking in. Jane's voice was calm, almost gentle. "You've just confirmed it. Mr. Edmund, your partnership with Lydia was built on greed and revenge, but it unraveled because you underestimated the power of observation. You see, people talk in a village like this. They notice things. A stranger, near the manor, a coded note, a purchase at the chemist's, and I, as Miss Primrose, was merely a listener." Edmund's shoulders slumped, his defiance crumbling. "You've no proof," he muttered, but the fight had gone out of him. Jane turned to the squire, her expression softening. "Squire Thornton, I've taken the liberty of informing Constable Evans. He's waiting outside with 2 officers. They have the ledger, the note, and Mr. Grayson's testimony about the toxin. I believe they'll find ample evidence to proceed." As if on cue, the heavy oak doors swung open, and Constable Evans stepped inside, his face grim. 2 uniformed officers flanked him, their eyes fixed on Edmund and Lydia. The villagers parted, creating a path as the officers moved forward. Lydia sobbed, her hands covering her face. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Edmund said it would. Be easy, just scare him, take the money. Edmund glared at her, but his voice was hollow. You're weak, Lydia. You always were. Constable Evans cleared his throat. Edmund Thornton, Lydia Grayson, you're under arrest for attempted murder and conspiracy. As the officers led them away, the room erupted in chatter, the villagers' voices a mix of shock and relief. Clara rushed to Jane, her eyes shining with gratitude. Miss Primrose, or whoever you are, thank you. You saved my uncle, and you saved me. Jane smiled, patting Clara's hand. No need for thanks, my dear. I'm simply a visitor who dislikes loose ends. As the crowd dispersed, Squire Thornton approached, his face etched with exhaustion but also relief. Miss Primrose, I don't know how you did it, but I'm in your debt. Will you stay for tea? Jane's eyes twinkled. A kind offer, Squire, but I'm afraid I have a train to catch. St. Mary Mead is safe again, and my work here is done. She stepped into the fading light, her knitting bag tucked under her arm. As she walked toward the village station, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. Miss Primrose had served her purpose, fooling all but the killer, and even they had underestimated her. The train whistles sounded in the distance, and Jane Marple, unmasked at last, felt the quiet thrill of a puzzle well solved. Chapter 14. The quiet departure. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of St. Mary Mead, shrouding the village in a delicate veil that softened its edges and hushed its usual bustle. Jane Marple, no longer Miss Primrose, stood at the edge. Off the village green, her small suitcase resting by her feet. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp grass and the distant promise of autumn. Her grey coat, neatly buttoned, and her familiar cloached hat, tilted just so, marked her. Returned to herself, Miss Marple, the unassuming spinster with a mind sharper than a paring knife. The masquerade was over, and with it, the intricate dance of deception she had orchestrated to unmask a killer. She glanced at the village clock, its hands ticking toward the arrival of the 10:15 train. There was time, yet time, to savor the quiet victory, to reflect on the human frailties she had unraveled, and to bid farewell to a place that had, for a brief moment, become her stage. St. Mary Mead had surprised her, as villagers often did. Beneath its postcard charm lay currents of envy, greed, and desperation, all woven into the tapestry of daily life. She had seen it before, of course, in countless other hamlets, but each new puzzle brought its own peculiar flavor. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft crunch of gravel behind her. Clara Thornton approached, her auburn hair catching the weak sunlight, her face no longer shadowed by suspicion or fear. The young woman's steps were lighter now, her shoulders unburdened by the weight of her uncle's distrust or the spectre of a frame-up. She wore a simple green dress, its hem brushing the tops of her boots, and carried a small basket covered with a checkered cloth. Miss Marple, Clara said, her voice warm but tinged with a hesitance that suggested she was still adjusting to the truth of Jane's identity. I hoped I'd catch you before you left. Jane turned, her eyes crinkling with a smile that was both kind and knowing. My dear Clara, I'm glad you did. I was just thinking how this village has a way of keeping one on their toes. Clara laughed, a sound like the chime of a bell. That's one way to put it. I still can't quite believe it. Miss Primrose, a retired schoolteacher, was you all along. You had us all fooled. Not all, perhaps, Jane said, her tone gentle but pointed. The guilty ones were watching a bit too closely, weren't they? Clara's smile faded slightly, her gaze dropping to the basket in her hands. Edmund and Lydia. I never imagined they could hate so much, or plan something so cruel. Jane nodded, her expression softening. People can surprise you, Clara, and not always for the better, but you've a good heart, and that's what matters. You trusted your instincts, even when the world seemed against you. Clara's cheeks flushed, and she held out the basket. I brought you something. Just a small tokensome scones from Mrs. Hattie's recipe, and a jar of my raspberry jam, I thought. Well, I thought you might like something to remember St. Mary Mead by. Jane accepted the basket, her fingers brushing the worn wicker. How thoughtful. I shall enjoy these on the train, and I'll think of you when I do. You've been a great help, Clara, whether you realize it or not. Me, Clara's eyes widened. I hardly did anything. You were the one piecing it all together, the letters, the poison, the hidden passage. I'm still dizzy thinking about it. Jane chuckled, a sound as soft as the mist around them. Oh, my dear, you did more than you know. Your honesty, your openness, they gave me the threads I needed to weave the truth. A detective, you see, is only as good as the people they observe. Clara looked as though she might protest, but instead she smiled, a mix of gratitude and awe. Will you come back? To St. Mary Mead, I mean. It won't be the same without you. Jane's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the patchwork fields beyond. Perhaps one day, she said, though. Her tone suggested she doubted it. Villages like this have a way of moving on, don't they? But I'll carry it with me, in my own way. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the village waking slowly around them. A milk cart rattled by, its driver tipping his cap to Jane, unaware of the role she had played in saving Squire Thornton's life. A pair of children darted across the green, their laughter cutting through the stillness. Life, Jane thought, had a remarkable way of resuming its rhythm, even after the darkest of notes. Clara, Jane said at last, there's something I'd like to share with you. If you'll indulge an old woman's whim. Clara's brow furrowed, but she nodded eagerly. Of course, anything. Jane gestured toward a nearby bench, its wood weathered but sturdy, overlooking the green. They sat, the basket resting between them, and Jane folded her hands in her lap, her posture as composed as ever. When I first came to St. Mary Mead, she began, I wasn't entirely sure what I'd find. Those cryptic letters, they were vague, almost teasing, but they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I've learned over the years to trust such instincts. They're like the first ripple on a pond, hinting at something larger beneath the surface. Clara leaned forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. What made you decide to come as Miss Primrose? I mean, why the disguise? Jane's lips quirked into a faint smile. Disguises, my dear, are not always about hiding. Sometimes they're about seeing more clearly. As Miss Primrose, I could move among you all without drawing attention. People speak freely around a harmless old schoolteacher. They don't guard their words as they might with a stranger asking too many questions. Clara nodded slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle of her own. And you saw everything. The way Edmund watched Uncle, the way Lydia always seemed to be lurking. I missed it all. Not missed, perhaps, Jane corrected gently. You Felt it, didn't you? That unease, that sense that something wasn't right. That's a gift, Clara. Never doubt it. Clara's fingers twisted in her lap, and she looked away, her gaze settling on the church spire in the distance. I suppose I did, but I was so afraid of being wrong, afraid of losing Uncle. I thought maybe I was imagining things. Jane reached out, her hand resting lightly on Clara's. Fear can cloud the mind, but it can also sharpen it. You were brave, Clara, braver than you know. You spoke to me even when you were frightened. That took courage. Clara's eyes shimmered, and she blinked rapidly, as if to chase away tears. Thank you, Miss Marple, for everything. Uncle's awake now, you know. He's weak, but the doctors say he'll recover. He asked about you this morning, wanted to know who this Miss Primrose really was. Jane's smile widened, a rare glimpse of mischief in her eyes. Did he now, and what did you tell him? I said you were the cleverest woman I'd ever met, Clara replied, her voice steady now, and that you saved his life. Jane waved a hand dismissively, though her expression softened. Oh, nonsense. I merely pointed the way. The truth has a habit of revealing itself, if one knows where to look. They sat for a while longer, the conversation drifting to lighter things, the village fete. The scandalous gossip about Mrs. Hattie's new hat, the prospect of a harvest festival. Jane listened, her eyes bright, storing away the small details that made St. Mary Mead so vividly alive. She had always believed that the smallest moments, a glance, a word, a gesture, held the key to understanding the human heart. As the church clock struck 10, Jane stood, smoothing her coat. I mustn't miss my train, she said, though. There was a reluctance in her voice, as if she were loath to leave this moment behind. Clara rose too, clutching the empty basket. Let me walk you to the station. It's the least I can do. Jane hesitated, then nodded. I'd like that. The walk to the station was short, the path winding past ivy-covered cottages and the old stone bridge where Jane had once overheard a crucial snippet of gossip. The village seemed to bid her farewell in its own quiet way. The rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of life resuming its course. Clara walked beside her, her steps matching Jane's measured pace. The station, the platform, was nearly empty, save for a porter stacking crates and a young couple sharing a hurried goodbye. The train's whistle sounded in the distance, a low, mournful note that seemed to echo Jane's own quiet melancholy. She turned to Clara, her expression serene but tinged with something deeper. You'll look after yourself, won't you? Jane said, her voice soft but firm. And your uncle? He'll need you now, more than ever. Clara nodded, her throat tight. I will, and I'll never forget what you've done for us. Jane reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, neatly folded handkerchief, its edges embroidered with tiny forget-me-nots. She pressed it into Clara's hand. A little something to remember me by, she said, her eyes twinkling. Not that I expect you'll need it. Clara clutched the handkerchief, her fingers tracing the delicate stitching. I'll treasure it, she whispered. The train pulled into the station, its brakes hissing as it slowed. Jane picked up her suitcase, her movements brisk now, as if to outrun the sentiment creeping into the moment. Goodbye, Clara, she said, her voice steady. Keep your eyes open. The world is full of puzzles, but you've a good head for solving them. Clara smiled, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Goodbye, Miss Marple. Safe travels. Jane boarded the train, choosing a window seat in a quiet carriage. As the train began to move, she looked out at Clara, who stood on the platform, waving until the station faded into the distance. Jane leaned back, her hands folded in her lap, the basket of scones and jam resting beside her. She thought of St. Mary Mead, of the lives she had touched and the secrets she had uncovered. Each case, she reflected, was like a novel, its chapters filled with characters who revealed themselves in unexpected ways. The countryside rolled by, a blur of green and gold, and Jane's mind wandered to the ledger she had found in Thornton. Manna, the coded note at the bazaar, the fleeting glimpse of Edmund's guilt. She had seen it all before, in different forms, in different places. Human nature, she mused, was as predictable as it was surprising a paradox she had spent her life unraveling. She opened the basket and took out a scone, breaking it gently in half. The scent of butter and warmth filled the air, and she smiled. To herself, Clara's jam would be sweet, she was sure, just as the girl herself was. She took a small bite, savoring the taste, and let her thoughts drift to the next adventure. There would always be another puzzle, another village, another truth waiting to be uncovered, as the train carried her away from St. Mary Mead. Jane Marple felt a quiet contentment settle over her. The village was safe, its secrets laid bare, and she was ready to return to her own life, her own garden, her own small corner of the world. But she knew, deep down, that the world would call her back another letter, another mystery, another chance to see what others missed, and when it did, she would be ready.